Chapter 657. Was that right? Yes and no. Yes, that was because history had indeed developed this way. However, with the appearance of Yang Qindong, history had already deviated from its original path. Bai Ming's emperor, Zhu Qiyu, had only limited his influence to the north. This gave him more energy to control the new Gandusi region. Ever since Zhu Qiyu started doing this, not only did Bai Ming's control over this place become stronger, but the garrison here was no longer useless. The number of soldiers had also increased by a lot. This made this place Bai Ming's recruitment warehouse. If there was a war with the southern Ming Empire one day, there would be an endless stream of soldiers being sent to the front lines. However, such a conscription warehouse was actually tricked by someone else. It was imaginable how furious the generals of the various guard posts would be when they heard this news. This was no longer riding on a tiger's head, but riding on a tiger's head and shitting on it. This was intolerable. Yella also saw through this, so when he spread the news, a huge net had been set up to target the 5-star army. A huge war was unavoidable. Narcissus Town. After 3 days of public hearings and 7 days of conscription examinations, 6,600 new recruits had been selected and were officially assigned to the various divisions and battalions. More than 6,000 people had joined all of a sudden. This number was much more than the original mercenary army and 5-star army. This unavoidably lowered the 5-star army's combat ability and even pushed the mercenary army, which was a first-class army, down to a second-class army. This was the pain of expanding the army. It was unavoidable. Fortunately, with Yang Qindong's leadership, as long as they went through the baptism of war, he believed that the 5-star army would definitely shine brightly and become a first-class army again. After staying in Narcissus Town for 12 days, the team of close to 12,000 people finally had to leave. Before he left, Yang Qindong left behind many weapons he had seized from the Borte tribe and Bagan tribe. According to him, there were close to 8,000 young adults and 50,000 civilians in Narcissus Town. They belonged here and had the right to defend their rights, so he left these weapons for them to use in forming their own army. Yang Qindong believed that with weapons in Narcissus Town, no one would take the initiative to bully them as long as they were united against external threats. Of course, a person's path still had to be walked by themselves. Yang Qindong could not take care of them forever. Perhaps one day he would point his army at the new Gan prefect, and the civilians would really be liberated. Yang Qindong did not know how long he would have to wait for that day. However, he was clear that his current mission was to get to the Walla region. If they were able to fight evenly with Bai Ming, he would not attack. Instead, he would head northeast to test the strength of the Mongolian cavalry. If possible, he would go north to the Golden Horde. That was also ruled by the Mongolians and would be the Russian region in the future. As a country that spanned across the Eurasian continent, Russia had yet to rise. It had already lived under the rule of the Mongols for more than 200 years. In history, the Golden Horde was in a period of decline. Taking advantage of this opportunity to occupy this place and prevent the unborn Russia from ever appearing again was one of the main reasons he brought his army here. Of course, before doing this, he had to balance the military strength of northern Ming and Vala. Only when they were balanced and kept each other in check would he be able to free himself to deal with the Mongolian issue. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would have to make a move on the stronger side. After all, no matter if it was Walla or Bai Ming, Yang Qindong did not want either of them to become stronger. With a goal in mind, they followed the military plan and headed west to the Walla region after leaving Narcissus Town. Compared to before they entered Narcissus Town, the 5-star army was a lot stronger. When they walked on the main road, they looked a lot more majestic. It was obviously difficult for such an army to hide their tracks, so they were quickly targeted by the Bai Ming cavalry from Saha River City and Taining City. This time, Chiliarch Yella personally led 300 cavalry from the Saha River Guards. Along with him were 300 cavalrymen from Peaceful City, led by Vice Qianhu Lu Dai. A total of 600 cavalry followed behind the 5-star army. If they were slow, they would be slow. If they were fast, they would be fast too. It was obvious that they could not beat them, but they would definitely bite them to death. The news of the sudden appearance of Ming cavalry was immediately sent to Yang Chendong, who was on his white dragon horse. Reconnaissance Battalion Commander Su Yinsheng, who was also riding on a horse, came to Yang Chendong's side. Thanks to the expansion of the army, he had filled up another battalion and returned to his position as battalion commander. 6th Young Master, we have already asked around. The ones following us are Ming cavalry from the Saha River Guards and Taining City. They have a total of 600 cavalry. Oh, right, the 2 Kiliarchies leading the troops are called Yella and Ludai. They are both Nuzan. I heard from the captives that they are very good at fighting, Su Yinsheng said excitedly. Although both Yi La and Lu Dai were very careful, if they wanted to follow the 5-star army, they would have to send out scouts to follow them. Just 2 hours ago, Su Yinsheng had used the 95 style to injure 2 enemy scouts on horseback. From their mouths, he had hurriedly rushed over to report the situation to them. 600 cavalry? Nuzan generals. Yang Chendong's lips twitched into a smile. Looks like news of what happened in Narcissus Town has already spread. They should already know that we were the ones who stole over 2,000 war horses from Jian Province, Northern Guard and Northern Guard. Su Yinsheng was originally feeling smug about getting some information about the enemy, but after hearing Yang Chendong's analysis, he was naturally confused. 6th Young Master, that shouldn't be. We did everything cleanly from the beginning to the end. Although many people in Narcissus Town know about this, we just left. The news shouldn't have spread so quickly, right? Haha, nothing is absolute. Who knows if there are other channels in Narcissus Town that can spread the news to the outside world? Yang Chendong shook his head. He would never underestimate any enemy, nor would he think that he was the smartest person, because anyone who did this would not live long. There is nothing wrong with thinking the best of things, but preparing for the worst. All right, increase the number of scouts at the front. If I'm not wrong, there should be people waiting for us at the Liao River area in front of us. His tone was neither hurried nor slow, but his attitude was very firm. Su Yinsheng was very puzzled when he saw all this. How did the 6th Young Master know that there would be enemies waiting for them ahead? He was the leader of the scouts, okay? However, since this was what the 6th Young Master said, Su Yinsheng naturally could not object. He only agreed with a dubious thought and rode off. Liao River was a large river that blocked the path of the 5-star army. There were only 2 ways to enter the Walla area from Narcissus Town. One was to go north over the mountains and cross the Daxing and mountain range, or go west and cross the Liao River. Considering that the army was now all cavalry, passing through a primitive forest like the Daxing and mountain range was extremely difficult. In the end, Yang Chendong made a decision and decided to take the Liao River. However, if they wanted to pass through the Liao River, they would definitely have to return to the territory under the Jian Province Guard's jurisdiction. It would not be easy for so many troops to take the path. It was very likely that a great battle would be unavoidable. Fortunately, Yang Chendong had already made preparations for this. He wanted to train his troops, and what was the best way to increase an army's combat strength? Of course, it was a great battle to his heart's content. It could be said that when Yang Chendong chose to enter the Walla through the Liao River, he had already made preparations for a battle with the Ming army. However, what he never expected was that because he wasn't able to return, the news was leaked ahead of time. Right now, at the Liao River, it wasn't just the nearby Ming's 30,000 guards that were waiting for him. Chapter 658. On the other hand, although these northern Ming guards had been established for quite some time, they were limited by their environment and had not experienced any great battles. With their short-sightedness, it was easy for them to have an arrogant attitude of thinking that the heavens were number 1, the earth was number 2, and they were number 3. This was the time to teach them a good lesson. Calm and collected, full of vigor. After Yang Qindong digested the information and firmly memorized it in his heart, he raised his head again. At this moment, his face was still filled with confidence, and his gaze was incomparably firm. Pass down the order, summon all the regiments and regimental commanders for a meeting. As they marched, Yang Qindong met with Wu Sheng and the other regimental commanders to confirm that they would not change their route. They had made the final decision to fight the Baiming guards head-on. What was worth mentioning was that Yang Qindong's troops were not without other options. For example, they could turn back now. Instead of going through the Liao River, they could go through the Dixing and mountain range. Although the path would not be easy to traverse, they could completely avoid the northern Ming guards. However, no one had expressed this intention since the beginning of the meeting. It was as if this choice did not exist. In the eyes of these regimental commanders, they only had one thought, and that was to kill, and kill again. After deciding to fight the Baiming guards head-on, the next step was to mobilize the troops before the battle. In order to maximize the strength of the Jurchens and Mongolians who had just joined, Yang Qindong said that for every enemy they killed, every enemy's nose would be awarded 1 point and 10 taels of silver. In ancient times, there were many ways to record one's achievements. The most common way was to cut off the enemy's head to prove one's achievement. It was fine if one only killed 1 or 2 enemies, but if there were too many, one's entire body would be covered in heads. It would affect one's strength, and it would still look too bloody. Yang Qindong suggested that the beheading should be changed to cutting off the nose, also known as cutting off the nose in ancient times. Once a person's nose was cut off, it was likely that not many people could continue to live. The so-called achievement was based on 100 points. Those who had more than 100 points were qualified to become an auxiliary soldier. Those who had more than 1,000 points were qualified to join the Cold Front. This was also Yang Qindong's tolerance towards the Jurchens and the Mongol cavalry. If it were any other alien race, no matter how great their contributions were, they would not be qualified to test Lung Feng. On the other hand, these two ethnic groups were heavily influenced by Han culture. If they were good material, he would not be stingy in polishing them. The rewards were passed down by the division commanders. When they found out that they could get 10 taels of silver for every enemy they killed, the Jurchens and Mongols, as well as the Han riders who had just joined the water ferry town, were all excited. The reason why they were willing to leave their hometown with the 5-star army was because they had a good impression of the army, but more importantly, they wanted to use this platform to show their worth. What was value? Earning more military merits and earning more taels of silver was the most direct manifestation of this. For a moment, they were all rubbing their fists. Whenever they had time, they would take out the whetstones they brought with them to sharpen the sabers in their hands even brighter and faster. The newcomers wanted to perform well and fight for the top prize. As veterans, Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers would not give in either. Over the past few days, although the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town looked at them with a hint of respect, it could be seen that the respect was due to envy and respect for the continuous fire guns in their hands. As for the combat power of the horses, it seemed like they were being looked down upon. This was something that the proud Lung Feng soldiers could not accept. What was the Lung Feng? It represented the strongest existence, the proudest existence. Once they appeared, they would become the focus of attention. How could they allow others to look down on them? This was a form of blasphemy to their identity. How could they make others respect them? Of course, they had to perform well on the battlefield. Therefore, after the mobilization before the battle, Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers had been training non-stop apart from sleeping and traveling. Getting on the horse, getting off the horse, slashing, increasing speed, dodging, and other movements were all trained tirelessly. Unknowingly, their strength improved bit by bit and became stronger. Compared to the hard work of Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers, and compared to the sharpening of the cavalry, the Baiming army's camp by the Liao River was very relaxed. Ever since they came to the new, Gandusi region, the Baiming guards had become the ruler here. especially when the other factions were still very weak and had not been able to rise up. They were the sky here, the boss here. Since they were the boss, of course they had a sense of superiority. They only needed to point their weapons at a place, and that place would have to submit. This seemed to have become an iron law. As time passed, they got used to being high above others and used to bullying others. The more they were like this, the more dissatisfied they were with the 5-Star Army's actions. They did not have any ideas about the 5-Star Army, but instead they were targeted and tricked by someone else. How could they face this? If they did not get back at them, how could they face others in the future? The 5-Star Army had to pay the price. This was something they had all come to a consensus. As a result, the Jian Province Left Guard, Jian Province Guard, and Shenyang Central Guard all sent out their troops. 5,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry. In their eyes, this type of formation was enough to scare the 5-Star Army's legs until they went soft. Arrogant, and condescending. It made many of the northern Ming soldiers who came here treat this official mission as a vacation. Even though the scouts at the front were continuously sending back news, even though there were scouts at the front that had already been captured by the enemy, their side's formation should have already been known by the enemy. As the commanding generals of this battle, Jian Province Guard Commander Sun Hong, Shenyang Central Guard Commander Zhu Dehai, and Jian Province Left Guard Commander Tan Long Tian still had an appearance of victory in their grasp. Since you already know her strength, then you should feel even more fear, right? The 3 generals had this type of confidence. In reality, they also possessed great influence. This type of formation could scare many people without even fighting. For example, if this type of formation was placed in front of Borte and Ba Zhen, who had already been killed by 1,000 cuts, perhaps there really was no need to fight. They would have to consider surrendering or running away. This was precisely the powerful influence of the Baiming army. Meanwhile, this type of influence was established precisely during Emperor Zhu Di's reign. This emperor who relied on great strength to fight his way to power, developing the navy, conquering Mongolia in the north, conquering Jiaoji in the south, establishing great contributions. He also struck fear into the hearts of the other races around the great Ming dynasty. Once they heard that this was the great Ming dynasty's army, they would often collapse without a fight, defeat set in stone. Unfortunately, that was already in the past. The defeat of Tu Mu already indicated that the great Ming dynasty had fallen from its peak. If they did not change and did not work hard, after 100 years, they would completely walk out of the stage of history. These were all things that Yang Qindong knew. These Baiming guards were still unaware, still living under the powerful halo of their ancestors, still waiting for the 5-Star Army to dismount and surrender. The ignorant were fearless. It was precisely because they did not think that the 5-Star Army was that powerful that they were destined to pay the heaviest price in the upcoming battle. 3 days later, the 5-Star Army finally appeared 20 miles away from the Liao River and quickly set up camp here. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and the fragrance of meat permeated the air. There was a lot of meat, wine, cigarettes, and other things that were prepared by Yang Qindong before he came to the new Argonne-du-Sea. The meat was cured and could guarantee that the meat would not spoil for a certain period of time. When the fragrance of the meat began to spread, the entire camp instantly became lively. Lung Fong and the auxiliary soldiers were better off as their meals were not bad. They could not eat hot food unless they were marching or fighting and needed to be hidden. If it was during normal times, except for breakfast, there would be meat for almost every meal. They were used to it. On the other hand, the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town and the Windchaser cavalry were overjoyed. Most of them were young, and this was the time when they could eat. Since there was enough meat, everyone was naturally prepared to have a big meal to satisfy their appetite. Of course, when the fragrance of the meat permeated the air, everyone knew very well that the war was about to begin. However, no one was nervous. Whether it was the battle-hardened Lung Fong, the Windchaser cavalry, or the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town, they were all used to seeing life and death. To them, war was a process of death. The only difference was one's strength and luck. At the same time, war was also a process for them to reap rewards. Once they won, the benefits they received would be much greater than usual. As the saying went, wealth comes from danger. Needless to say, after witnessing the might of the continuous fire muskets in the hands of the Lung Vanguard and the shiny steel sabers in the hands of the Lung Vanguard, the auxiliary troops and the Windchaser cavalry, although they were envious, they also wanted to own such powerful and excellent weapons one day. At the same time, they were very confident. With such powerful comrades, what was there to be afraid of? Victory would definitely belong to them. The 5-star army finally arrived and set up camp 20 miles away. When the news reached the Ming army's camp, the 3 generals in charge gathered together. However, there was no prepared sand table in front of them, and the 3 of them did not intend to sit down and discuss tactics. There was only meat and wine in front of them. The 3 of them ate and drank as they talked about their experiences. Most of the time, they talked about the war between Ming and Walla. Both sides suddenly fell out with each other. Then, both sides stationed their troops at the border. After that, they began probing each other. Once they got used to each other's tactics or figured out each other's strength, a huge battle would be unavoidable. Chapter 659. As part of the Ming army, the 3 generals weren't nobodies. Today, they were talking about the war over there. Who knew when they would be transferred to the front lines? Therefore, the 3 of them were talking about the situation over there. They ignored the 5-star army that had arrived in front of them. Even though the scouts had reported that there were more than 10,000 people on the other side and that they were all cavalry, the 3 generals still didn't take them seriously. Perhaps they already knew that the 5-star army was recruiting soldiers in Narcissus Town. From their point of view, how strong could a newly formed army that hadn't even gone through training yet be able to display such a strong combat strength? They were the Ming army and represented the strongest country and army in the world. Why would they be afraid of a new army that hadn't undergone the baptism of the battlefield? However, they had quite a number of war horses. After defeating the 5-star army, the 3 generals could sit down and discuss how to divide them up. The 3 generals drank and chatted until they were a little tipsy. Only then did they disperse. Only then did Sun Hong, the commander of the Jian province guards, speak. "General Zhu, General Tang, I hope that we can unite tomorrow and restore our glory." "Yes, please rest assured, General Sunday, Zhu Dehai, and Tang Longtian also cupped their fists with a serious look on their faces. Then they strode out of the tent. At this moment, the 3 of them didn't take tomorrow's battle seriously. In their opinion, it was like an adult beating a child. They usually didn't want to lower themselves to your level, but once they stretched out their arms, victory would be decided with a slap. The mercenary camp was also unusually quiet at this moment. Other than the soldiers on night duty, everyone else had already gone to sleep after eating their fill. There would be a big battle tomorrow, so everyone needed to conserve their energy. In Yang Qindong's commander's tent, there were still oil lamps that hadn't been extinguished. With that qi, Yang Qindong would often rest for 4 hours a day to ensure that he would be full of energy and vigor. At this time, he was not sleepy yet. He was standing in front of the sand table and looking carefully. Even though he held another military meeting before dinner and discussed all the possible problems that should be prepared and might happen, he still wanted to verify if there was any negligence before the war. Perhaps some people would attribute all of Yang Qindong's achievements to Okura, but if it wasn't for his hard work and diligence, even if he could win, he wouldn't have made such great progress in less than 4 years. "Young master, it's almost midnight. Go and rest." Tiger's Mane walked into the tent sleepily. He first patted Beta, Persei, who was standing at the side waiting for orders, and told him to take the time to rest. Tiger's Mane then walked over to the sand table. "You slept well." Yang Qindong raised his head and casually glanced at Tiger's Mane, who was walking over, then waved his hand. "I'm not sleepy yet. I don't need anyone to serve me here. You can go and sleep a little longer." When Tiger's Ming came to Yang Qindong's side, he had already recovered his energetic appearance. "No need, young master. I'll sleep after dinner. I've slept enough, hee." Then, after looking at the sand table, he asked curiously, "Is there a problem?" "No." Yang Qindong straightened his body and lightly shook his head. Then, with a smile on his face, he said, "I've made sufficient preparations. As long as nothing unexpected happens, the outcome of the battle will be decided. Accidents. It doesn't seem to rain tomorrow, right?" "Tigers," Ming said casually. After following Yang Qindong for so long, he already knew that weather changes could sometimes become an important factor to affect the battle. But when he walked out of his tent just now, he saw the sky full of stars. Presumably, it would be a sunny day tomorrow. Of course there won't be rain. Yang Qindong continued to smile, and a confident light appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Not only will there be no rain, it should be a sunny day tomorrow. How about this? You go and inform the soldiers to wake up later tomorrow morning. Let them sleep for 2 more hours. No, 3 hours will do. Yes." Tiger's mane was stunned at first. He didn't understand why he had to wake up so late. But since it was the 6th young master's order, he would of course do his best to carry it out. But in his heart he thought, could it be because the troops didn't get a good rest during the march, so the soldiers were allowed to sleep a little longer? Actually, it wasn't just Tiger's mane who thought this. The next morning, the other soldiers who woke up 3 hours later than usual all had the same thought. They slept for about 10 hours. Everyone was full of energy and didn't feel tired at all. The 6th young master felt sorry for them, but he didn't know that Yang Qindong had his reasons for doing this. The 10,000 soldiers of the Northern Bright Guards had indeed woken up very early in the morning. In fact, they were all woken up before the sky was completely bright. Although some of them didn't get enough sleep and were a little dissatisfied, when they thought about how the 5-star army had already appeared in front of them, even if they didn't take the initiative to attack, they would still fight back. In other words, there was bound to be a big battle today. Since that was the case, it didn't matter if they slept a little less. It wasn't just the soldiers. Even the commanding generals Sun Hong, Zhu Dehai, and Tang Longtian woke up an hour earlier than usual. Afterwards, they started a fire to cook, put on their armor, and brought out their war horses. They were all ready for battle. The sky gradually brightened and the sun began to rise. Under the cloudless sky, it indicated that today would be a sunny day. "Hee, the weather is good, but I don't know if the 5-star army's mood is good too." Sun Hong, who had already mounted his war horse, looked at Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian and laughed heartily. He had a relaxed expression on his face. The 2 generals naturally laughed along. At this moment, they seemed to have already seen a large number of war horses being captured by them, and the scene of them achieving great military merits. Reporting, the 5-star army has begun to move. A troop of nearly 2,000 cavalry has already left their camp and is slowly approaching us. They are currently about 18 miles away from us. A scout rode his horse to the front of the 3 generals and quickly jumped off his horse and knelt on the ground as he reported, "Are you going to make a move now?" "Good. Scout again." Hearing that the 5-star army was indeed going to attack, Sun Hong didn't think much of it. Everything was within their expectations. The 3 generals had already reached a consensus. Since the 5-star army had arrived at the Liao River, if they wanted to cross, they would have to face them. At that time, they would only have 2 choices, attack or defend. However, if they only defended, they wouldn't be able to get supplies for a long time. Thus, attacking was the most likely option. Now that they heard that the other party had sent out close to 2,000 cavalry, they naturally wouldn't panic. On the contrary, they were somewhat dissatisfied with the fact that they only sent out 2,000 soldiers. With such a small number, it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. The scout obeyed the order and turned around to scout again. After the time it took for an incense stick to burn, another scout returned and reported that the 5-star army's cavalry was only 12 miles away from them. After such a long time, They only managed to run 8 miles. The 5-star Army's cavalry is too slow. This time, without waiting for Sun Hong to express his opinion, Shenyang's Central Guard Commander Zhu Dahai had already laughed out loud. This person was slightly chubby. When he laughed, his warhorse seemed to be greatly pressured as it paced back and forth a few steps. The armor on his body also trembled along with his laughter. It looked quite comical. Haha, not bad. The 5-star Army's cavalry is too slow. It seems like there's nothing to worry about. Sun Hong laughed and nodded. At this moment, he was even more confident in this battle. After hearing Commander Sun Hong and Commander Zhu Dahai's words, the other Qianhu and Baihu commanders beside them all nodded. The commander of the Jianzhou left guard, Tang Longtian, directly shouted, "Inform the soldiers to be alert and prepare to face the enemy." The Baiming City Guard soldiers, who were originally standing by the river lazily, were all alerted by their superiors. Some of them held large swords, some of them held shields, some of them held bows and arrows, some of them held spears, and some of them prepared barricades. They all began to move. They were only waiting for the 5-star Army's cavalry to appear so that they could teach them a lesson. 20 miles away, in the 5-star Army's camp, the soldiers had a good night's sleep. After eating a nutritious breakfast, they began to wait for the order to march. In the command tent, after waiting for the regimental and battalion level officers to walk in one by one, they stood in 2 rows and looked at Yang Qindong, who was sitting at the head of the table. After looking at each officer, Yang Qindong, who was originally serious, suddenly smiled and explained, "The plan has changed. The time of the attack has been extended to 2 hours, but I don't know if everyone is ready now." Reporting to the 6th young master, "The preparations are complete. We can attack at any time." The officers were full of energy as they spoke. Good. Influenced by his words, Yang Qindong nodded his head in satisfaction. Then he looked at Su Yunsheng, the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, and asked, "How are the Bugs, Northern Ming cavalry scouts, being dealt with? Have the 1st and 2nd regiments set off according to the plan?" Su Yunsheng, who was called, stood up straight and raised his head. He was full of energy as he said, "Reporting to the 6th young master, 32 Baiming were killed an hour ago. Commander Wu and Political Commissar Qin have already set off according to the plan. They should arrive at the designated location in 2 hours and launch the attack." Beautiful. Yang Qindong snapped his fingers and looked at Su Yunsheng. The reconnaissance battalion did a good job. After this mission is completed, you will be the first to receive the credit. Now, I have another mission for you. You can take care of the 600 cavalry soldiers that are tailing us. Chapter 660. When Su Yunsheng heard that he could obtain a first merit, his face was already filled with excitement. Now that he heard that there was a battle to fight, he immediately stood at attention in excitement. "6th young master, please rest assured. I will definitely complete the mission." With regards to Su Yunsheng, Yang Qindong was still very reassured. Up until now, whenever a mission was given to him, there was not a single time where it was not completed well. Knowing that the Baiming cavalry behind him would not cause any trouble, his gaze once again fell on Zhue Feng and Lu Zhua. Then he used an encouraging tone and said, "This time the 3 divisions will only be cooperating in battle. Only your 2 reinforced regiments will be the main force. This is also the first time you guys are going to battle since the expansion. I hope that you guys will be able to produce a perfect result. This young master also has great confidence in you guys. Now go and prepare for battle." After saying this, Yang Qindong intentionally raised his hand to look at his watch. "The attack will begin at 10:30 in the morning. You guys have less than an hour to prepare." "Yes." Zhue Feng and Lu Zhua simultaneously gave a military salute. Then they led their respective battalion commanders out of the command tent. Next, it was time to use actions to perform. No matter how beautiful the words were, It was better to do things well and fight the battle well. In the blink of an eye, the large tent became empty. Seeing that there was no one else around, Tiger, Ming could not help but come to Yang Chendong's side. "Young master, you see that they all have a mission. The auxiliary barracks can't always be idle. The 6 battalion commanders have already reported to me. They also want to contribute and go to the battlefield." According to the original plan, the auxiliary barracks really had nothing to do with this battle. Their main mission was to take care of the logistics and the resources in their hands. When they first came to Sea Town from the sea, they brought a lot of resources. If anything happened to them, then the food and water of the army would become a problem. However, Yang Chendong could understand Tiger's man's feelings. After the expansion of the army, the 6 auxiliary battalions were placed under his direct control. Later on, he gave the authority to Tiger's man to train his abilities. This made Humang so happy that he almost choked. As Yang Chendong's closest and most trusted person, he had a lot of power. Not only did the 2 guards have to listen to him, even the other division commanders had to be respectful when they saw him. But after all, he had never led an army before. This was his regret. Now it was all right. The young master had helped him make up for this regret. Now that he had 6 auxiliary barracks in his hands, if there was a big battle, he definitely wouldn't be able to participate, so there was no need to mention how anxious he was. Yang Chendong pondered for a moment. Since he wanted to train his tiger's mane, how could it be called training if he didn't go to the battlefield? Okay, then you can leave 2 of the 6 auxiliary battalions to watch over the resources. You can lead the other 4 battalions. But there is one condition. Let the 2 reinforced regiments charge first. You can only lead the charge 15 minutes after they charge out. Okay, I promise I won't lead the charge. Tiger's man seemed to be afraid that Yang Chendong would go back on his word, so he hurriedly stood at attention. Then he ran out of the command tent with a smile. Although the order to attack was the last, no matter what, it was still a chance to lead the troops. This was already a big breakthrough for him. Ming garrison camp. The infantry and cavalry were separately preparing for defense. According to the plan, they would first block the first wave of attacks from the 5-star army. Then the cavalry would suddenly charge out and completely defeat the 5-star army. The development of reality was very smooth at first. There were already scouts who reported that the 5-star army was moving towards them. Although there were less than 2,000 cavalry, it was enough for them to prepare for battle. What they didn't expect was that when the previous scout reported that the enemy was less than 12 miles away, the next scout reported that the 5-star army suddenly stopped and then retreated. They retreated? Sun Hong's face was filled with disbelief. He then looked at Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian beside him. Zhu Dehai, who was being stared at by him, also had a face full of confusion. He could only find an explanation for himself. Could it be that they found something wrong? But that shouldn't be the case. We didn't prepare any ambush. They really didn't prepare any ambush. Perhaps in the eyes of the 3 generals, even if they were to face the 5-star army head-on, they still had enough confidence to defeat them. Even if the enemy's numbers were not less than theirs, even if the enemy was all cavalry, they still thought so. It had to be said that they were that confident. Oh no, it should be said that they were that arrogant. It was precisely because they didn't prepare any ambush that the 5-star army's sudden stop and subsequent retreat was so confusing. Just as the 3 generals were looking at each other, another cavalry scout reported that the 5-star army had started moving again, but it was obvious that they were moving at a very slow speed. What are they doing? Sun Hong was confused. This kind of advance, stop, retreat, and advance again. Moreover, the speed of the advance was very slow. It was really out of his expectations. It had to be said that he had led troops for many years, but not to mention seeing this kind of fighting method. It was the first time he had even heard of it. General Sun, do you think they are afraid? That's why Tang Longtian, the commander of the Jianzhou left guards, seemed to have suddenly thought of something and asked, After hearing Tang Longtian's explanation, Zhu Dehai, who was also at a loss, silently nodded his head. It seemed like this was a reasonable explanation. Otherwise, why would the enemy move forward and retreat in a completely different way from the norm on the battlefield? Ha ha ha. Sun Hong also believed that this was the result and immediately laughed out loud. Not bad, not bad. It seems like the enemy is really afraid. However, I believe that the general of the 5-star army is still very arrogant and wants to fight with us. Unfortunately, his soldiers are much smarter than him, so they are moving forward and retreating at the same time. Yes, it must be like this. If this is the case, victory is already on our side. Sun Hong was so happy and excited that Tang Longtian naturally laughed along with him. At the same time, he suggested an idea. General Sun, why don't we take the opportunity to kill our way out and seize victory while the enemy is hesitating? Sigh, no rush, no rush. Let them be anxious and afraid for a while. After a while, the time will be more ripe. At that time, we will be able to achieve victory in one go. Ha ha ha. Sun Hong laughed towards the sky, full of confidence. His laughter caused the surrounding generals to laugh as well. It was obvious that everyone's thoughts were the same as Sun Hong's. Amidst the laughter, the 3rd Regiment of the 3rd Cold Front Division was slowly advancing 10 miles ahead. Under the leadership of their regiment commander Chanyang, their marching speed was extremely slow. It was already slower than walking by 5 minutes. The 1st Battalion commander Lu Qing rode beside Chanyang, who was wearing a black cloak, with an envious expression on his face. The cloak was indeed very cool. Wearing it would unknowingly make one look very cool. Unfortunately, the requirement was that only the regiment commander and above could wear a cloak. Lu Qing was only a battalion commander and had just been promoted from a company commander after the expansion. At this moment, he could only look at Chanyang with envy. His gaze moved from the black cloak to Chanyang. Lu Qing took the initiative to speak. Regiment commander, can we only lure the enemy this time? The division commander and the political commissar can lead the 1st and 2nd regiments into battle, right? Our mission. Lu Qing stopped halfway through his sentence. However, Chanyang knew what he wanted to say. He turned his head to look at him and spoke in an extremely calm tone. We are in charge of luring the enemy. This is the military order of the 6th young master. Are you doubting the 6th young master? His voice wasn't very loud. In fact, only the 2 of them could hear him clearly. However, this sentence was enough to make Lu Qing's face turn pale. Cold sweat flowed down his body. No, I wouldn't dare. How could I doubt the 6th young master? Humph. Chanyang knew that Lu Qing didn't have the guts to do so. Not only Lu Qing, but also no one in the army would dare to think that way. Otherwise, the 6th young master wouldn't even need to make a move. All right, completing the mission is what we need to do. As for killing the enemy, the higher-ups will naturally arrange it. Besides, the order is very clear. We can enter the battlefield, but we can't do it so quickly. We need to see the performance of the 1st and 2nd regiments first. We can only attack 15 minutes after they start attacking. So, save up your strength and perform well when the time comes. Yes, regiment commander. When the time comes, you will see the performance of the 1st Battalion. Lu Qing couldn't help but clench his fists. As a new battalion commander, he indeed needed to perform well in order to submit a perfect answer sheet. The conversation between the 2 came to an end. The 2 of them didn't have any doubts about the order they received. For example, why did they have to retreat after advancing for a while? For example, why did they have to slow down? Since it was an order given by the 6th young master, it must be correct and the most reasonable. In fact, it wasn't only Regiment Commander Chunyang who didn't think about this question. Even the other regimental commanders didn't think about this question. If they thought about it, They would think that the sixth young master delayed the attack in order to completely outflank the enemy. At this moment, it was already noon. The sun was moving towards the highest point in the sky and began to roast the earth. 5-Star Army's main camp. When the clock pointed to 10:30, the regiment commander of the 1st Regiment, Zhuai Feng, and the 2nd Regiment commander, Lu Zhua, looked at each other and raised the sabers in their hands. Then 2 black cloaks rushed out. They each led 2,000 cavalrymen and rushed out of the camp. They directly charged towards the Ming army, 20 miles away. Chapter 661. While the 2 reinforced regiments were moving out, there were 2 groups of cavalry slowly approaching from the north and south of the Liao River. The ones leading them were the 3 RD Division's Commander Wu Sheng and the division's Political Commissar Qinbo. As division commanders, the color of their cloaks had already turned pure white, making them look much more handsome and valiant when they wore them. They had also become the symbol of the army. The 2 men walking at the front of the 2 groups looked at the time on their wristwatches as they walked. Thanks to the reconnaissance unit, they had excellent weapons that could kill enemies from hundreds of feet away. This allowed them to kill Ming scouts early on. Even when the 2 cavalry regiments arrived at the Liao River from the north and south, sealing off Ming's left and right paths of retreat, the enemy still didn't notice. At this point, the first step of the mission was completed. The next step was to wait. When the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments suddenly appeared, they would seize the opportunity to attack Ming's army from the flanks. They would break through their defenses and cause chaos in their ranks. This would help the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments gain control of the battle and obtain the final victory. In short, this time they would play the supporting role and help the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments complete the final attack. From this order alone, it could be seen that Yang Qindong had put a lot of thought into the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments. In order to increase their combat strength, he actually made the entire 3rd Division play the role of supporting troops. The time for the final attack was getting closer and closer. Wu Sheng led the 1st Regiment to the north, while Chen Bo led the 2nd Regiment to the south. They had completely surrounded the Ming army. Right at this moment, the ground began to tremble. The experienced cavalry knew that this was caused by a large group of cavalry approaching. At the front of the battlefield, Zhuai Feng and Lu Zhu each led a reinforced regiment and rushed over. During this time, they overtook the 3 RD Division's 3rd Regiment that was in charge of attracting the enemy's attention. Then, without stopping, they rushed towards Ming's main camp. In the center of Ming's army, Sun Hong and the other generals also felt the ground tremble. The scouts in charge of gathering information also returned and reported that there were at least 4,000 to 5,000 5-Star Army cavalry rapidly approaching them. A great battle was on the verge of breaking out. It was inevitable. Sun Honggan sat on the horse without any panic. All of this was part of his plan. After all, in a battle between 2 armies, there would always be one side that would charge first. General Zhu, when the battle starts, please lead 2,000 infantrymen to attack the enemy from the left. This general will lead 2,000 cavalrymen to attack the enemy from the right. I'll have to trouble General Tang to take charge of the middle corps. Are you all okay with that? Sun Hong glanced left, and right before his gaze landed on Generals Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian. Even though Sun Hong's position was the highest among them, the commander of the Jian Province Guards, a major 3rd rank existence, while the other 2 were minor 3rd rank and major 4th rank military officials, both of them far inferior to him. But after all, they were not from the same institution. They could choose to listen to his arrangements, or they could choose to act on their own. This was the reason why he was so polite. Understood. Fortunately, before the great battle, the 3 of them had already sat down together to discuss tactics and tactics. They agreed that Sun Hong would be the leader, so now there naturally wouldn't be any problems. They cupped their fists and agreed. Very good. Then have the infantrymen make preparations to intercept the war horses. We have to stop them no matter what. Let these cavalrymen know just how insignificant their strength is when facing our Ming's army, just how small their strength is, and just how small their strength is. Meanwhile, with only one person blocking their first wave of attacks, the other side are all new recruits, so their morale will definitely take a hit. They won't be far from becoming a defeated army. Sun Hong's face was full of high spirits. This time they couldn't head to the front lines to fight Walla to the death, so they would just display their skills by the Liao River. After Sun Hong's voice fell, General Tang Longtian, who was in charge of commanding the infantrymen, immediately pulled out his sword and pointed it to the sky. He shouted loudly, "So infantrymen, listen to my orders and prepare for battle." A deafening sound began to ring out continuously. 1,000 shield-wielding soldiers with iron shields gathered in the center of the battlefield. From afar, they looked like a black flood of steel, forming an iron wall, blocking the path of the 5-star Army's cavalrymen. In front of this black iron wall, there were 1,000 Ming soldiers setting up stakes and other objects. Behind the black iron wall, 1,000 archers also stood in rows, holding strong bows in their hands and carrying quivers of arrows on their backs. They looked like they were ready to draw their bows and shoot at any time to attack the 5-star Army's cavalrymen. On both sides of the black iron wall, there were northern Ming soldiers armed with large sabers and long spears. Their mission was to charge forward like a dog that had seen a bone once an enemy fell off their horse and cut them into pieces in the shortest time possible. This was the formation used by Ming infantrymen against cavalrymen. It was imitating the formation of the Southern Dynasty's founding emperor Liu Yu. In the past, when facing the powerful Northern Wei cavalrymen, Liu Yu had 700 soldiers go ashore, and the Yanha River tribe set up hundreds of chariots to defend against the cavalrymen's charge. The two ends of the chariot formation were curved like a crescent moon. This was the formation that people loved to talk about. Because they didn't have chariots, the Ming soldiers used stakes and shields to replace them. Although the effect might not be as good, as long as they could block the first charge of the 5-star Army cavalry, they would be in a stalemate. The cavalry, led by General Sun Hong and General Zhu Dehai, would then surround them from both sides. In the end, they would ambush the enemy cavalry from all sides and kill them. It could be said that the Ming soldiers had made sufficient preparations this time. They looked like they wanted to hold back the 5-star Army. If the cavalrymen weren't prepared once they entered the formation, it would be very difficult for them to escape. However, the problem was that the 5-star Army's cavalrymen weren't prepared. The Ming Army's formation had already been set up. Sun Hong and Zhu Dehai each led 2,000 cavalrymen to surround the enemy from both sides. The vanguard of the 5-star Army's cavalrymen could be seen with the naked eye. They were constantly approaching the center of the battlefield and were getting closer and closer to the Ming Army's archers. Kill! Kill with me! Zhu Feng took the lead. Just like his name, he became the vanguard of the charge. Even the 2nd Regiment's commander, Lu Zhua, was at least 200 meters away from him. Archers, get ready! Tang Longtian, who was in the middle of the formation, saw the enemy cavalrymen getting closer and closer. When they were about to enter the archers' shooting range, he raised his right arm and looked like he was ready to fire at any moment. The 1,000 Northern Ming archers also quickly drew their bows and aimed at the front. Once the order was given, they would release the arrows in their hands and kill the enemy. The atmosphere on the battlefield had become extremely tense. As the 5-star Army's cavalrymen got closer and closer, the atmosphere became even more tense. It was like a taut bowstring that could break at any moment. This is the time. Blow the bugle call. Wu Sheng, who had already moved to the north and south sides of the Ming Army, used his binoculars to see all the movements on the battlefield. When he saw that the battle was about to begin, he gave the order to charge to the 5 officers who had been waiting for a long time. Beep, 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 beep. the loud bugle call suddenly sounded and broke the silence between heaven and earth. Then the bugle call sounded, and 3,000 cavalrymen suddenly charged into the battlefield from the north and south. They came to the sides and the back of the Ming army. The sudden change caused Tang Longtian, who was in the middle of the formation, to turn around and look. When he saw that there were actually countless enemy cavalry appearing, he first said, "Not good," and then ordered his deputy beside him, Wang Tong of the 30,000 guards, to lead the remaining 300 cavalry to charge out and stop the cavalry of the 5-star corps that suddenly appeared behind them. General Sun Hong, who was riding on a horse to surround the 5-star army's cavalrymen, was also shocked by the huge formation behind him. He had a feeling of uneasiness just now. He kept thinking that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure it out. Now he finally understood. It turned out that he didn't receive any information from the scouts on both sides. He didn't even see them. It turned out that they were killed by the 5-star army. How did they do it? Those who could become scouts were smart and agile. It was understandable that 1 or 2 of them were killed. He sent out a total of 32 scouts on both sides. Why didn't any of them come back to report? A big question mark appeared in his heart. However, it wasn't the time to think about these things. What he needed to do now was to win in the chaos, since there were already enemy cavalrymen behind him. Even if he went back now, he wouldn't be able to avoid losses. He might as well go according to his original plan and kill them, as long as he could heavily injure or eliminate the 5-star army's cavalrymen. He would be able to retreat and deal with the enemy behind him. Originally, he wanted to wait for the enemy to enter the infantry formation. He wanted to wait until both sides were in a stalemate before making his move. But now, it seemed that he couldn't wait anymore. Since that was the case, he could only attack first. Sun Hong quickly made a decision. The 2,000 cavalrymen who were originally moving slowly started to move under his command. They suddenly accelerated and charged towards the 5-star army's cavalrymen. But just as they rushed forward, an even bigger problem appeared. Strong rays of sunlight shone into their eyes, causing them to close their eyes involuntarily. They couldn't even see what was happening in front of them. How could they fight this battle? Sun Hong was also unable to see the situation in front of him because of the strong sunlight. He couldn't help but think in his heart, could it be that even the heavens want to take care of the 5-star army? How could he have known that Yang Qindong intentionally launched his attack 4 hours later? The effect was finally revealed. It was noon, so the side facing the sunlight would naturally suffer great loss. This was also the reason why the cavalrymen of the 3 divisions would sometimes advance and sometimes retreat. They wanted to drag out the time until the sun was high up in the sky. When the sunlight was absolutely effective, they would launch their attack. In a situation where even the weather was taken into consideration, Sun Hong's charge naturally caused a huge problem. It was equivalent to announcing the outcome of the battle, and even the death penalty for some people. Chapter 662. The sun is too bright, I can't see anything. Not good, I can only ride with my head down. I can't see the situation in front of me. The cavalry below had only just sped up when all sorts of questions were sent back. As the main general, Sun Hong had a bad feeling in his heart. He knew that it was time for him to make a decision. If he hesitated for even a moment longer, he would suffer irreparable losses. Retreat. Everyone retreat and regroup with the infantry. He knew that if they continued to charge forward, they wouldn't even be able to use a fifth of their strength. How would they fight this battle? He immediately gave the order while turning his horse around. On the other side, Zhu Dehai also made the same decision as Sun Hong. He also led his troops towards the sun and similarly felt the blinding sunlight. He also knew that if they continued to fight, they would not be able to display their strength. Thus, he decisively gave the order to retreat. Just like this, before they could complete the encirclement, before the battle even started, the 4,000 Ming cavalry had no choice but to retreat. However, It was already too late for them to retreat. Behind them, the 3,000 cavalry from the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 3rd Division had already broken through the 300 cavalry led by Wang Tong. In front of 10 times the cavalry, Wang Tong had acted in a panic. After a single charge, Wang Tong was cut down on his horse by Wu Sheng, who was wielding a steel saber. With the death of their main general, the rest of the cavalry lost their morale. They put up a show of resistance and threw down more than 100 corpses before returning to the middle of the infantry. Behind these 100 over northern Ming dynasty cavalrymen, there were over 3,000 cavalrymen from the 5-star army. They urged their horses to chase after the northern Ming dynasty cavalrymen while shouting loudly. From time to time, they would shoot arrows with the bows in their hands. Without any morale, the 100 or so Baiming cavalry didn't even have the strength to fight back. After throwing down more than half of the corpses, less than 80 of them made it back to the middle of the army. Before they could even gain a foothold, Wu Sheng and Chen Bo had already led the 1st and 2nd regiments to kill their way behind them. Every time they raised their sabers, they would reap the life of an enemy soldier. At the front, Windchaser had already led a company of cavalry as the vanguard to kill Baiming's infantry. With their superb horsemanship, they leaped over the barricades on the ground and launched a series of fierce attacks on the shield-bearers. Due to the chaos at the rear, the 1,000 shield-wielding soldiers were already in disarray. The enemies at the front were also charging ferociously. Very quickly, some of the weaker Baiming infantry broke away from the formation. Every time this happened, they would be faced with the fall of a sharp saber or the result of a person's head flying off with a raise of a saber. Following Zhue Feng's arrival, 1st Battalion Commander Deng Yu, 2nd Battalion Commander Gao Danhua, and 3rd Battalion Acting Battalion Commander Hulu's subordinates all followed behind. With the advantage in numbers and the speed of the steeds, the infantry shield-bearers, who were already riddled with holes, suffered heavy pressure again and again. Finally, their formation was thrown into chaos, and they were all separated and killed by the cavalry. Regiment Commander Lu Jua of the 2nd Reinforced Regiment also rushed over. Seeing that the enemy's infantry were already in disarray and that it was only a matter of time before they were defeated, he turned his spear and aimed it at Zhu Dehai's 2,000 cavalry that were still retreating. Battalion Commander Ma in the middle, Battalion Commander Ding in the left, Battalion Commander Tay in the right. Everyone follow me and kill. Lu Jua had been promoted from the Auxiliary Regiment Commander to the Cavalry Regiment Commander. He wanted to perform well, but at this moment, Zhu Dehai's troops had become his stepping stone. In addition, the 3 battalion commanders under him were also outstanding cavalry. For example, 1st Battalion Commander Ma Xiangshan, 2nd Battalion Commander Ding Shan, and 3rd Battalion Acting Battalion Commander Temu were all people who had interacted with war horses for many years. He was very confident in their strength. Now that he had the opportunity, he naturally wanted to use his cavalry to attack his cavalry. He wanted to see the strength of his cavalry regiment, cavalry against infantry, and with the advantage in numbers, even if he won, there was nothing to brag about. However, when cavalry fought against cavalry, it would be a battle of swords and spears. It would depend on one's ability. The originally proud Ma Xiangshan and the others wanted to perform well. With Lu Jua's order, it could be said that it was exactly what they wanted. Immediately, the 2,000 cavalry of the reinforced regiment quickly changed direction and went straight for Baiming Zhu Dehai's troops who were still retreating. Zhu Dehai, who was retreating, let out a sigh of relief. They didn't have to face the sun anymore. This allowed his cavalry to display their original strength. As the main commander, he had more confidence in his heart. However, before he could fully recover from his shock, a large number of cavalrymen appeared in front of them. This cavalry unit was wearing all kinds of clothing. From afar, there were Nuzin's clothing, Mongols' clothing, Han people's clothing, and even army green clothing. It could be said that there were all kinds of clothing. However, they all had one thing in common, and that was that each of them held a shiny saber in their hands, and each of them wore a pair of ink-black goggles that protected their eyes from afar. Naturally, the northern Ming cavalry would be at a disadvantage if they were to face the sun head-on. However, with the addition of the sunglasses, the 2nd Regiment was no longer a problem. The glare of the sun had been reduced infinitely and was placed at the side. Right now, what they needed to do was to charge and charge. In the process of charging, the cavalry drew their bows and shot. As they approached, they shot the Baiming cavalry, who were not fully prepared. Zhu Dehai's troops, who were retreating, had already lost their formation. Not to say that their formation was in chaos, but it was not too far off. Perhaps if they were given a certain amount of time, they could reorganize their troops. But would Luge give them time? One side was unprepared and the other side was ready. One side was retreating in panic, and the other side was advancing bravely. Although the number of cavalry on both sides was the same, there were 2,000 cavalry. But the difference between being prepared and not being prepared was very big. So much so that before the cavalry of both sides officially came into contact, arrows rained down like raindrops. No less than 100 people in the vanguard of the Baiming cavalry were shot and fell from their horses. And this was just the beginning of the contest. When Ma Xiongfeng led the 1st Battalion to charge into the Baiming cavalry unit, and when Dingshan's 2nd Battalion and Teimu Er's 3rd Battalion stabbed into the Baiming army's formation like 2 sharp knives, Zhu Dehai's face finally showed a look of fear. At this moment, he realized that the cavalry under his command had become a pot of porridge. They didn't know where to charge and what to do. The steel cavalry sabers and ordinary cavalry sabers began the 1st round of clashes, followed by the 2nd round, 3rd round, and 4th round. After 4 rounds, the panicked and unprepared Baiming cavalry suffered great losses. About 1/7 of the cavalry was cut off from their horses. But what was even worse was that after 4 rounds of clashes, some of the cavalry sabers in the hands of the Baiming cavalry actually showed signs of breaking. The slightly better ones also had large gaps. If you want to attack first, you must first sharpen your weapon. Originally, they were not prepared enough. Now that the enemy had taken the initiative, they were caught unprepared. Then, their weapons were not as sharp and durable as the enemy's. Some of the Baiming cavalry, although still seated on their horses, had nothing in their hands that could be used. Some were broken sabers, and some were even barehanded. How were they going to fight the following battle? Retreat. Shocked by the strength of the 5-star army, shocked by the sharpness of the enemy's cavalry sabers, Zhu Dehai, who was protected by a dozen bodyguards, saw that his strength was not as good as the enemy's. He turned his horse around and madly galloped back. At this time, Zhu Dehai was very familiar with Sun Tzu's art of war. The last of the 36 stratagems was to run. If you can't win, run. This was the best example. At this time, Zhu Dehai was completely dizzy. He had already forgotten that once he turned around, he would be facing the glaring sunlight. But at this time, he had completely forgotten all of this. There was only one voice in his mind, and that was to run. As long as he could escape, he might have a chance to live. The situation was not good, so he turned around and ran without hesitation. Zhu Dehai still had a very decisive heart, but his luck was really too bad. After running against the sunlight for a few li, a large army suddenly appeared in front of him. Because of the light, he only saw the enemy swarming towards him when he was less than 2 li away. The dust that covered the sky and covered the sun was flying. It was the cavalry led by the 3 RD Division's 3rd Regiment, the Spring Sun Division, and the Independent Regiment Tiger's Mane. There were close to 3,000 people. According to Yang Qindong's orders, they had set off 15 minutes later. As if they were afraid that the enemy would be wiped out, from the beginning of the charge, the 2 cavalry forces were racing against each other, afraid that they would be 1 step slower than the enemy. Originally, after 15 minutes, the 2 reinforced regiments, the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the 3rd Division, Baiming's army would have been defeated. If they were lucky, they might be able to clean up the mess. But never would they have thought that before they even reached the battlefield, they would already see the enemy. Although there weren't many of them, only a few hundred cavalry, in the eyes of the spring sun and tiger's mane, they were already a piece of juicy meat. Independent regiment, charge with me. Tiger's mane laughed heartily. He kept urging his war horse to charge towards Zhu Dehai's troops. Regiment commander, what do we do? The 1st Battalion's commander Lu Qing urged his horse to Spring Sun's side. His face was filled with anxiety. What do we do? Of course we have to go. There's no such thing as superior and inferior on the battlefield, hee. Spring Sun laughed wildly. By the time he finished speaking, he had already charged out on his war horse. Tiger's mane was his superior. Even his division commander, Wu Sheng, respected him. But this was the battlefield. There was no such thing as modesty when killing the enemy. Seeing the regiment commander dashing out without any hesitation, Battalion Commander Lu Qing laughed out loud and followed after him. The soldiers of the 3rd Regiment also yelled and shouted as they charged forward with their sabers in hand. Chapter 663. Poor Zhu Dehai. He thought that his actions were decisive. He thought that he was like a gecko with a broken tail and that he could finally escape. But he never imagined that he would have to face 2 ferocious armies. When he discovered his opponents, his fate was already sealed. The cavalry from both sides collided in the blink of an eye. Just as the cavalry clashed with the cavalry, blood splattered everywhere. Sharp sabers flashing with silver light were constantly raised and chopped down. One by one, the Ming cavalry was forced to block the attacks. Some of them couldn't even withstand one blow and were immediately chopped down from their horses. Some of them were quite good on horseback, but when faced with continuous chopping, how many times could they block? They could only raise their arms a few more times. In the end, they still couldn't avoid the fate of being chopped down from their horses. Zhu Dehai's horse riding skills were considered passable. He was barely able to exchange blows with the 2 5-star army cavalrymen. Under the powerful impact, he could already feel his arm swelling. Just as he was thinking that he wouldn't be able to withstand a few more collisions like this, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to lift his arm anymore. However, when their weapons collided for the 3rd time, a completely unexpected scene occurred. The saber in his hand actually broke into 2 pieces. How could this be? This scene caused Zhu Dehai's eyes to widen. The quality of the saber in his hand wasn't bad. How could it break after only 3 collisions? If he didn't even have a weapon, how could he fight? All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Then, another cavalry from the 5-star army flew past them. Zhu Dehai reflexively raised his right arm to block the attack. But then, an intense pain spread from his arm to his entire body. Then he stared in disbelief as his right arm was separated from his body. Fresh blood spurted out from his body and filled his eyes. His right arm was already gone. He didn't feel the pain because the saber in the hands of the 5-star army was too fast. It was so fast that he didn't even feel the pain before everything was over. And before he could cry out in shock, another cavalry from the 5-star army rode past him. This was a scene that he would never forget for the rest of his life. For the first time, he could clearly see his own back. That was the last thing he saw before his head flew high into the air. Then, there was only darkness, an endless and boundless darkness. The hundreds of Ming cavalry that escaped were quickly disintegrated under 2 charges from the 5-star army. About 2/3 of them died in battle, and 1/3 was taken captive. At the same time, the Ming cavalry under General Sun Hong was also targeted by the reinforced cavalry regiment. When Windchaser discovered that Lu Zhu's troops were chasing after Zhu Dehai's troops, he gave the task of dealing with the Ming infantry to the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 3rd Division. He led the reinforced cavalry regiment to target the more powerful Sun Hong's troops. using young Master Yang Qindong's words. 10,000 cavalry against 5,000 Ming cavalry and 5,000 Ming infantry. The battle hadn't even started yet, but the outcome had already been decided. Rather than calling it a battle, it was more accurate to call it a training exercise. Even if it was a training exercise, how to ignite everyone's fighting spirit, how to create an invincible heart through this battle. This was the true meaning of this battle. Since it was a training exercise, of course they had to choose the strongest enemy as their opponent. Looking at the battle horses, Ming's 2,000 cavalry was barely enough to be seen. Everyone in the reinforced cavalry regiment, put on your glasses and follow this regiment commander. After adjusting the direction of the battle horses, Windchaser released a loud shout, taking the lead and bringing the 1st and 2nd regiments of the reinforced cavalry regiment to charge towards the right side of the battlefield. People shouted, horses neighed, banners covering the skies, bright 5-starred banners fluttering in the wind everywhere. The bugle call that replaced the sounds of drums sounded again and again, loud and clear, pouring into the ears of everyone on the battlefield. Sun Hong, who was still backing up, had a downcast expression on his face. He ignored the direction of the sunlight, placing him in a completely passive state from the very start of the battle. He knew that he was going to suffer greatly today. However, he still didn't believe that he would lose, just that his losses would be a bit more serious. It was because he was leading 2,000 cavalry from the Zhenzhou Guard, the elites of the northern soldiers, possessing second-rate fighting strength. Unless they were facing the Mongol cavalry and Walla cavalry who had lived on horses since childhood, no enemy would make him feel fear. Release the arrows, draw the blades, charge! Cut the enemy into several pieces. Let them know what kind of fate awaits those who make our Zhenzhou Guard cavalry their enemies. A roar sounded. Sun Hong held a large blade that was over a zhang in length. After releasing a loud shout, under the protection of a group of personal guards, he increased the speed of his horse, charging towards the reinforced cavalry regiment led by Windchaser. The 1st Battalion is at the front, the 2nd Battalion is in the middle, and the 3rd Battalion is at the back. Windchaser similarly didn't show any weakness, brandishing the cavalry blade that flickered with cold radiance. After releasing a loud shout, he also took the lead and launched a fierce charge. The two forces of cavalry with similar strength and numbers finally began to clash an hour after the battle began. When enemies met on a narrow path, the courageous would emerge victorious. A battle of cavalry where every blade drew blood began. Charge! Charge! The commanders of both sides separately gave the final military orders. A total of 4,000 warhorses clashed together by the Liao River, becoming a great battle. In just the first clash, there were already countless streaks of bright red blood that splashed in all directions. At any moment, there would be cavalry soldiers that fell off their horses, or there would be broken limbs that flew into the air. There were Ming cavalry, Nuzin cavalry, Mongol cavalry, and Han cavalry that fell off their horses. At this moment, the cavalry all displayed their abilities. At this moment, no one would show you the slightest bit of leniency because of your background or race. At this moment, if you didn't kill others, then you would be killed by others. No one was an exception. Windchaser raised his cavalry blade, already continuously hacking down more than 10 people. At least 4 Ming cavalry were chopped off their horses by him. At the same time, 3 enemies were injured by him. His body also suffered 2 cuts. Fortunately, he had the protection of the bulletproof vest, so these 2 cuts didn't truly injure him. Zhenzhou Guard cavalry is unordinary after all. After another charge, Windchaser, who had rushed to the back of Ming cavalry, reined in his horse. He sighed in his heart, and at the same time his fighting spirit was infinitely aroused. You guys are very strong, right? That's good. The stronger the opponent, the more you can train yourself. He believed that after this battle, although there would be some losses in the reinforcement regiment, their combat strength would definitely increase by a lot. Wasn't this what the sixth young master and himself wanted? Not far away, Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo, who had already divided the Ming infantry into several groups, also noticed the battle on the right side of the battlefield. They saw that the reinforcement regiment already had more than 100 people killed or injured, but they didn't have any intention of joining in. If an army wanted to grow, the process must be bloody. Only after experiencing this could they become a truly strong army. During this process, others couldn't help much. Of course, Wu Sheng and Uncle Chin were also watching this place. As long as they noticed that the reinforcement regiment was not as strong as the enemy, they would immediately intervene. In short, they would never allow their side to be defeated in front of them. However, the reality was that this kind of thought was destined not to appear. After this clash, the two sides had already swapped positions. Hundreds of cavalry from both sides had fallen, as well as many lonely war horses. However, this didn't mean that the battle was over. It was just the beginning. After the two sides swapped positions, the dazzling sunlight once again shone on the faces of the Ming cavalry. Sun Hong's expression was frighteningly dark. Just now he had also displayed his might and killed at least 3 5-star army cavalry. At the same time, he also noticed that the enemy had something that could protect their eyes. He didn't know what it was called, but he knew that with that thing, they didn't seem to be afraid of the dazzling sunlight. The enemy had it, but he didn't. Now that he had to face the sunlight and attack, the disadvantage would uncontrollably appear. The cavalry of the Jianzhou Guard seemed to be in danger. While Sun Hong was hesitating, the cavalry of the 5-star army cavalry on the opposite side once again charged over. It was still the 1st Battalion at the front, followed by the 2nd Battalion and the 3rd Battalion at the back. Ma Xiangshan, the commander of the 1st Battalion, shouted loudly. Combined with the blood of the enemy that flew to his face when he killed the enemy just now, it made him look very scary at this moment. There was a feeling of a killing god that walked out of hell. Ma Xiangshan held the saber in his right hand and the reins in his left hand. He attached his body to the horse as much as possible to protect the streamline of his body and reduce the wind resistance. This allowed him to charge forward at a faster speed. This speed could multiply the power in his hands. At this time, once the saber was slashed out, even a small tree stump could be easily cut down. This was the power of the combination of speed and sharpness of the saber that was given to them this time. Although it wasn't as long as the spear and saber, because it was short, it was more powerful and nimble. In addition, it had a very satisfying sharpness. The number of enemy cavalry that died in Ma Xiangshan's hands had already exceeded 5 people, which made him very satisfied. He also seemed to be born for the battlefield. After killing several people, not only did he not feel the slightest bit of fatigue, but he was also very excited. This excitement naturally turned into boundless killing intent. When he waved the saber again, his face was only left with a flush of excitement. The more he fought, the braver he became. This was the description of soldiers like Ma Xiangshan. Following Ma Xiangshan's loud shout, the soldiers of the 1st Battalion were also inspired and infected. They all shouted and rushed forward together with the battalion commander. From afar, he was like a sharp arrow that directly pierced into the ranks of the Ming cavalry. Chapter 664. What was even worse was that behind this arrow, the 2nd Battalion's Ding Shan's troops and the 3rd Battalion's Timu, Er's troops also formed arrows and flew straight over with an unstoppable momentum. In comparison, the northern Ming cavalry was naturally much weaker in terms of aura. In the first clash, they relied on their self-confidence, relying on the momentum that the world would avoid whenever they appeared. However, when they truly clashed, they discovered that the 5-star army was much stronger than they had imagined. Their unstoppable momentum, their sharp sabers, and their merciless ruthlessness actually caused them to suffer a small loss in the first clash. Looking at the center of the battlefield, they accounted for 2/3 of the cavalry that were killed. They were like little flowers in a greenhouse, always thinking that they were the most beautiful in the world. However, when they entered the primeval forest, they were lucky enough to see all kinds of beautiful flowers blooming. When they saw flowers that were far more beautiful than them, they naturally had the thought of viewing the sky from the bottom of a well. The clash with the 5-star army also taught the Ming cavalry a deep lesson. It let them know that apart from the Mongol Empire and the Walla Empire, they were not the strongest cavalry in the world. Once such a thought appeared, it could not be suppressed. If they lost in terms of temperament, their morale would naturally be much weaker. Taking advantage of this time, the 5-star army once again clashed. Looking at the vast number of enemies charging at them, most of the Ming cavalry could not even open their eyes completely. In addition to the lack of morale, the morale of the army began to fall into chaos. Don't panic, don't be afraid. We will always be the strongest. Everyone follow me and attack. Sun Hong sensed the change in the mood of the cavalryman beside him. After he knew that something was wrong, he shouted loudly. Then, without giving the other cavalrymen time to react, he led a dozen of his personal guards and was the first to gallop out. No matter what, he had led troops for many years and had experience. The more it was like this, the more Sun Hong knew that he could not hesitate. He could not give the soldiers any more time to think. Otherwise, once the morale of the army crumbled, there would be no way to continue fighting this battle. Sun Hong took the lead and charged out. With him leading the charge, many of the Ming cavalry who were still hesitating followed him. However, they were still one step too late and allowed Sun Hong to become the vanguard. Moreover, there were only a dozen of them in the vanguard. Logically speaking, when cavalry clashed, the general of each side should be protected. After all, if the general was there, the morale of the army would be there. If the general died, the morale would be gone. However, at this time, he did not care about that. He didn't dare to stop and wait for the cavalrymen behind him to converge. Who knew if the cavalrymen behind him would also stop if he stopped? Such a move was no different from courting death in a situation where the cavalrymen were charging at him. Sun Hong, who had no choice but to brace himself and charge forward, did his best to avoid the main force of the 5-star army cavalry. He wanted to take a roundabout route and charge past the enemy cavalry. As long as he did not clash head-on with the enemy cavalry, there shouldn't be any danger. Therefore, what happened next was a puzzling scene. With Sun Hong as the vanguard, the dozen or so Ming cavalry didn't meet the imposing main force of the 5-star army cavalry. Instead, they dodged and charged to the side of the battlefield. This was a clear display of weakness to the enemy. It was even a cowardly action. It was something that the cavalry code of conduct did not allow to happen. It was because once one side did this, they would lose the morale of the army before the battle even began. If that happened, then it would be impossible for them to win this battle. As the commander of the Jian Province Guards, how could a dignified third-grade military general not know this principle? However, did he have any other choice? He was already the vanguard, so he didn't have any more cavalry to protect him. If he continued to clash head-on with the 5-star army cavalry, what difference would that be from courting death? The only thing Sun Hong, who didn't want to die, could do was avoid the enemy's main force. Even though doing this would make others look down on him, choosing the lesser of two evils, for the sake of his own small life, he could only act like a coward. Sun Hong suddenly rushed to the side of the battlefield, indeed allowing him to avoid the greatest risk. However, what he forgot was that there were still more than 1,000 Ming cavalry behind him. On the battlefield, following the general's banner, following the general's footsteps would never be wrong. Oftentimes, this was the most appropriate state to adopt under chaos. That was why, when Sun Hong suddenly changed directions, the Ming cavalry behind him also followed suit. They didn't know that Sun Hong feared death and battle. Under the blinding sunlight, they already couldn't see the movements of the distant 5-star army. Those who didn't know any better only thought that this was one of the general strategies, while all they had to do was follow the general's footsteps. That was why, when Ming cavalry suddenly collectively moved to the side, it was the same as completely exposing one side of their bodies to the 5-star Army's cavalry. 1st Battalion Commander Ma Xiangshan, who had originally already prepared himself for a life-and-death battle, when he saw that the enemy cavalry actually didn't face them head-on, instead exposing one side of their bodies to him. How could he let go of such a good opportunity? Raising his arm high, he brought the reinforced 1st Battalion's 6 companies of close to 600 cavalry to slaughter their way over from the side, delivering a heavy blow to the completely unprepared Ming cavalry, who didn't even have time to turn their horses around. With a raise of his hand and a fall of his blade, over 100 Ming cavalry were cut down from their horses, also throwing the enemy's formation into chaos. They just couldn't understand how this battle was fought. How did they end up exposing their flanks to the 5-star Army's cavalry? Was this really the path General Sun Hong pointed out? No matter what they thought in their hearts, it was a fact that they had suffered heavy losses. Following that, 2nd Battalion Ding Shan's troops and 3rd Battalion Taimu Er's troops arrived one after another. Again and again they faced the side, causing more and more Ming cavalry to be cut down from their horses. Countless cries of agony resounded throughout the battlefield. In the end, the war horses still crossed each other. After passing through 3 waves of Ming cavalry, there were only about 500 cavalry that managed to charge through. On the other hand, the reinforced cavalry only lost a few soldiers in the 2nd wave of charge. Sun Hong had used his wits to avoid the greatest risk. He survived, but because he didn't set a good example, the cavalry under his command suffered heavy losses. When he finally reined in his horse and turned around to look, he saw that there were only 500 cavalry left. His face immediately darkened, and then he panicked, lost, scared, and terrified. He was the commander, a dignified 3rd-rank Ming military officer. There was still a great future waiting for him. He definitely couldn't throw away his life here at this time. Many thoughts ran through his mind at this moment. As a result, after making a wrong decision, he made a second wrong decision, which was to run. He turned around and reined in his horse, galloping into the sunlight. Sun Hong already didn't have the courage to carry out a 3rd cavalry charge. He didn't have confidence in himself, nor did he have confidence in the cavalry under his command. Right now, what he had to do was immediately hurry back to the Zhenzhou Guard and then tell his superior about the 5-star Army's terror. Even if he had to be punished for this, he would accept it. In short, his life could be preserved, and then there would be a day when he could rise again. The 500 Ming cavalry, who had charged out of the 5-star Army's formation with great difficulty, saw their own brothers hacked to the ground with their own eyes. While they blamed their main general for his poor command, they also wanted to charge back and get revenge for their comrades. However, they never would have thought that their main general Sun Hong would run away just like that, bringing more than 10 personal soldiers with him. Retreat! Among the 500 cavalry, there are still 3 centurions. After exchanging a single look, they similarly made the decision to retreat. Even though after doing this, even if they returned, they would still be punished, but even Commander Sun ran, so were they still going to stay here and serve as live targets for the enemy? The 3 centurions made the same decision. The 500 cavalry turned around and fled, chasing after Sun Hong's figure. Cowards without balls. After a short rest, when Ma Xiangshan launched his 3rd charge, what he saw was precisely the scene of Ming cavalry fleeing. After cursing loudly from his horse, he immediately chased after them with the high morale 1st Battalion. Behind him, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, and the 2 companies directly under the regiment commander Windseeker also followed one after another. Right now, they had already won this battle. The only difference was how much of a victory they could expand to. If they could capture or kill the enemy's main general, then that would be perfect. However, after all, the enemy had fled a step first. So if they wanted to capture him, it wouldn't be easy. No matter how hard it would be, they should always try. Just like this, on the right side of the battlefield, Bai Ming cavalry was crazily running at the front. Behind them was a group of 5-star army cavalry following behind. Both sides were getting further and further away from the Liao River. Facing the dazzling sunlight, Sun Hong led a dozen personal guards to run at the front. From time to time, he would turn around to take a look, his face revealing a fortunate expression. Even though this time he acted as a coward, but this kind of method of immediately retreating when he couldn't defeat the enemy still caught the enemy off guard. It seemed like his little life was saved. Sighing in his heart, Sun Hong continuously used the horsewhip to whip his warhorse, wanting to quickly leave the battlefield and ensure his safety. As time passed, the dazzling sunlight wasn't as strong as before. Sun Hong could finally see everything in front of him clearly. Because of this, his eyes widened more and more, because he actually saw cavalry appear in front of him. In his impression, he definitely didn't send any reinforcements to support him. Then where did this cavalry come from? Could it be the reinforcements sent by Cha River Guards and Tai Ning Wei? Chapter 665. Yes, that must be the case. The thought flashed through his mind, and Sun Hong's face brightened up. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Although both of them were 1,000-man guards, and the total number of cavalrymen was only around 600, it was still not a problem to use them well. That way, it would be easier for him to escape. The fearful expression on Sun Hong's face was replaced by a hearty laugh. He led the 500 riders to meet the incoming cavalry head-on. The war horses of both sides were galloping forward, and the distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. When they were only 2 miles away, they could finally see the lineup of the other side. Their faces were still unclear, but from their clothes, they could already distinguish the identity of the other side. Fuck! Sun Hong couldn't help but curse when he saw the enemy's uniform, especially when he saw the 5-star flag fluttering in the wind. Enemy soldiers? Why are there enemy soldiers here? Could it be that the 5-star army predicted that I would be defeated and escape? Of course. It was expected that I would be defeated. I really didn't expect that I would be defeated. Everything was just a coincidence. The enemy was the 3 RD Division's 3rd Regiment's Spring Sun and Tigers Main's Independent Cavalry Divisions, 4 battalions. Not long after they charged out, they were lucky enough to encounter the defeated Zhu Dehai's troops. Naturally, they surrounded them and wasted some time there. Sun Hong thought that after such a long time, the battle would be over and they wouldn't need to do anything else. However, the heavens were really good to them. They encountered another Bai Ming army. After seeing that it was the Bai Ming cavalry, Tiger's Mane and Spring Sun didn't care about which division they were from. They were afraid that the enemy would steal their credit and charge forward with their swords drawn. The 2,000 cavalrymen were like cats that saw mice. They were afraid that if they were late, they wouldn't have the chance to kill the enemy. It was actually the 5-star army. Sun Hong's eyes widened and his body trembled. How could there still be a 5-star army here? Since they were so powerful, why didn't they just charge at the first time? If that was the case, wouldn't they be defeated in a single charge? How would Sun Hong know that the number of people in the 5-star army reported by the scout didn't include the people guarding the supplies? Those people were the independent soldiers. They were usually in charge of logistics, but they were elite soldiers on the battlefield during wartime. The reason why they didn't use their advantage in numbers was because they wanted to train the newly formed cavalry and strengthen the 1st and 2nd Regiment. If they came at him with a crushing force, then what was the point of training? Sun Hong, whose heart was trembling, seemed to be frozen in place. Then a soldier beside him shouted, "General, run quickly. They are coming." They were already close to 2,000 soldiers chasing after them, and another 2,000 were coming from the opposite side. How were they going to fight this battle? If they didn't run, what were they waiting for? Run? Where do you think you're going? Sun Hong's entire body seemed to have lost its spirit. The distance between them was too close, less than 2 li. A single charge would be enough to reach the front of the formation. There were also soldiers chasing behind them, so there was no way to run. Sun Hong had completely lost his confidence. After lamenting, he turned around and looked at the 500 soldiers behind him. He shook his head and said, "You guys should surrender. Perhaps you will still have a way out. Remember, don't resist. That will only be a meaningless sacrifice." Sun Hong persuaded his subordinates to surrender because he didn't want them to die like this. This was the only thing he could do as a general. Then he pulled out the sword on his body, and a bitter smile appeared on his face. Then he slashed his neck. His movements were too fast. Before anyone could figure out what was going on, Sun Hong had already fallen from his horse. His eyes were wide open as if he was expressing the unwillingness in his heart. But in the end, he still killed himself. The soldiers under him could surrender, but as the general, he absolutely couldn't do so. He still had his family and family behind him. If he really surrendered to the 5-star army, once the news spread, only his family would be implicated. So he only had one choice, death. Sun Hong died. Without their general, the 500 Ming cavalry chose to surrender when they were surrounded by the 5-star army. Among them, there were some hot-blooded men who wanted to die for a righteous cause. But before they could pull out their swords and prepare to fight, they were stopped by their fellow soldiers. You may not be afraid of death, but some people were. If your individual resistance angered the 5-star army and they were all killed, then wouldn't everyone be buried with you? In the end, the 500 Ming cavalry all surrendered. Normally, with 500 surrendered soldiers, everyone should be happy. But no matter how one looked at it, Tiger's Mane, Windchaser, and Spring Sun, they didn't have any smiles on their faces. It was clear that they were still depressed because they couldn't kill to their heart's content. When Sun Hong committed suicide, the Ming camp by the Liao River gradually quieted down. The general of this army, Tang Longtian, was captured, and the 30,000 guards commander, Wang Tong, was killed on the battlefield. With the death or capture of their generals, the Ming army also lost their will to fight. When they saw a large number of 5-star army cavalry surround them, they all threw down the weapons in their hands and chose to surrender. Right now, it was only 4:00 in the afternoon. The summer days were already very long, but at this time, the sky was still very bright. To be able to end the battle so quickly, it was far beyond everyone's expectations. This was 10,000 Ming army, and it was 10,000 Ming army that was prepared. But when faced with 10,000 5-star army cavalry, they only fought for a few hours before being wiped out. From this point, it was enough to prove the strength and terror of cavalry. It also proved how much of an advantage cavalry had when fighting infantry. Clean up the battlefield, check the military supplies, calculate the results, and send someone to inform the 6th young master. Victory at Liao River. 30 li behind the 5-star army's main camp. Battalion Commander Su Yinqing's reconnaissance unit and the 3rd Division's Battalion Commander Guanzhong were facing off against the Sa Cha River Guards and Taining Guards' 600 Ming cavalry. 1,000 Guards Commander Yi La and Taining Guards Vice 1,000 Guards Commander Lu Dai each led 300 Ming cavalry on a plain. The 2,000 Guards' faces didn't change much at this moment. They knew that this moment would come sooner or later. Since they had been following behind the 5-star army, they were already prepared for battle. Sir Yi, the enemy cavalry seems to be a bit more than us. Looking seriously at the 5-star army cavalry that appeared 500 meters away, Lu Dai estimated in his heart and asked 1,000 Guards Commander Yila, "So what if they have more people? It's just 100 or 200 more cavalry. We brought the world's most elite Nuzan cavalry. What is there to be afraid of?" Yi La's face was full of pride. For Nuzan to be able to become the Ming Guards' 1,000 guards, he was destined to put in more effort than others. He was also destined to have stronger strength than normal Han army generals. In fact, Yi La did rely on his own bravery to obtain his current position, while the other Qianhu mostly relied on their ancestors to obtain their high positions. He had always been working hard at the lowest level. After many bloody battles, he finally obtained his position. Not only that, as the 1,000 guards commander of Nuzin, he also used his authority to change his 300 cavalry to Nuzin cavalry. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the army he led had a glorious battle record of defeating 2,000 bandits. At this moment, they were only facing 800 5-star army cavalry. So what was there to be afraid of? More importantly, he was now wrapped in battle armor. From afar, his entire body was pitch black and there were no flaws. This was also where his confidence came from when he rushed into the battlefield. Perhaps because Yi La was too confident, or perhaps because he was infected by his confidence, Lu Dai, who was originally a bit worried, calmed down a lot. Haha, I have long heard that Sir Yi is very brave. To be able to join hands with Sir today is truly a pleasure. Since that's the case, allow me to join hands with Sir. Sir, please hold the formation. I will go test the enemy's strength. Lu Dai wanted to take the initiative to attack. In fact, half of the 300 cavalry he brought were Nuzin cavalry. This was where his confidence came from. Good, this 1,000 guard will watch General Lu display his might. However, please remember, if there is something difficult to deal with, immediately retreat. This general will come to your rescue. Yi La was very satisfied that Lu Dai wanted to take the initiative to test the enemy's strength. This was the Nuzin style. No matter how strong the enemy was, they would not be afraid and would dare to draw their swords. With Yi La holding the formation, Lu Dai was much more confident. He pulled out his saber and shouted to the 300 cavalry behind him, "Brave warriors, our chance to show off has come. Follow this general and charge. Kill!" The 300 cavalry formed by Nuzin and Han people roared in unison. Then they waved their whips and dashed toward the 5-star army. In the 5-star army, seeing the Ming cavalry charging, the battalion commander of the 3rd Division, Guanzhong laughed loudly. Then he looked at the calm Su Yunxing and said, "Battalion Commander Su, you are the treasures in the eyes of the 6th young master. For a charge like this, it is better for us, the direct division, to do it." Su Yunsheng really wanted to be the vanguard. But when he considered Guanzhong's words, that the scouts were made up of the most elite soldiers, it was indeed a waste of talent to use them in front of a cavalry formation that could easily be damaged. Su Yunxing nodded and said, "All right, please be careful, Battalion Commander Guan." "Ha ha ha. Don't worry, Battalion Commander Su. The person who can kill me hasn't been born yet." With a heroic laugh, Guanzhong pulled out his shining saber and waved it forward. "Direct division, follow me and kill." Chapter 666. Kill. Another deafening roar rang out as the 450 cavalrymen of the 5th Star Corps followed behind Battalion Commander Guanzhong. They charged towards the 300 Northern Ming cavalrymen that were swarming over. A cavalry charge was one of the most ancient and bloody ways of fighting. In the process of such a clash, there was not much skill involved. What was needed was the morale of both sides, the strength of both sides, and the strength of both sides. This was often a way of harming the enemy by 1,000, but also harming 800. But even if they knew this, the cavalry charge was still the favorite of many cavalrymen. This was because only this kind of battle could show the glory of the cavalry. This was what true men and warriors should do. The cavalry from both sides were like two torrents as they clashed against each other on the vast plains. Men shouted, horses neighed, weapons clashed, and shouts rose and fell one after another. In just a single clash, dozens of cavalry from both sides had fallen off their horses. At least a dozen war horses were heavily injured by the powerful inertia and fell to the ground. The sounds of the war horses neighing rang in the ears of every cavalry. In this clash, the division's direct subordinate battalions only had a slight advantage in terms of numbers. The casualty ratio on the battlefield was 7-13. They couldn't even kill twice as many people. This made Guan Zhong's face turn ugly. "Get ready, charge!" Guan Zhong once again swung his saber and launched a second attack. Compared to Guan Zhong, Lu Dai's face was even uglier. Half of the 300 cavalrymen he brought were Nuzan elite cavalrymen. Not only did they not gain any advantage in this clash, they even suffered a loss. This was something that he couldn't accept. Fortunately, the 13 cavalrymen that died were all elite cavalrymen. There wasn't a single Nuzan cavalryman. Suppressing the anger in his heart, Lu Dai raised his head and looked at the 5-star army cavalrymen charging over. He also waved his saber and shouted, "Kill!" Another clash of cavalrymen. This time both sides were clearly enraged and the casualty ratio increased. More than 30 cavalrymen died, including 3 Nuzan cavalrymen. The direct subordinate battalion lost 20 cavalrymen and a few were injured. "Charge!" Guan Zhong stopped his horse, turned around, and continued to wave his saber. Another charge came from Guan Zhong's mouth. Lu Dai also roared as he led his cavalrymen forward. Su Yunsheng, who was sitting on the sidelines, stared at all of this as he quickly assessed the situation. As the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, he had a much better grasp of the situation on the battlefield than Yang Qindong. After all, not every piece of information had to be reported. Some insignificant matters would often be stopped when they were reported to him. This also allowed Su Yunsheng to gain a better understanding of the 600 cavalrymen on the other side. Out of the 600 cavalrymen, 3/4 of them were Nuzan cavalrymen. There was also information that they were made up of the elite cavalrymen. Nuzan had spent a lot of effort to train them in order to increase their strength and influence. Su Yunsheng had seen the Nuzan cavalry before, just like the group of people represented by Hulu in Narcissus Town. Their strength was not bad, but it was only not bad. Compared to Lung Feng, they were still much weaker. However, the Nuzan cavalry in front of them seemed to be particularly powerful. It could be seen from the battle between them and the Nuzan cavalry. Moreover, the Nuzan cavalry didn't have the advantage in numbers. If the Nuzan cavalry had more troops than them, wouldn't the situation of the battlefield be changed? Just as Su Yunsheng was seriously observing the situation, the first company commander, Yenda, came over. "Commander, are you interested in talent?" To be able to enter the reconnaissance battalion, not to mention their skills, just their brains alone needed to be very flexible. They needed to constantly change according to the changes on the battlefield. Just by looking at Su Yunsheng's changing gaze, Yenda could roughly guess what was going on. It had to be said that this person's eyesight was very good. The first company commander, Yenda, could be said to be Su Yunsheng's direct subordinate. When Su Yunsheng was not around, he would be in charge of the reconnaissance battalion. This also proved his ability. Now that he stood up and asked, Su Yunsheng nodded. The 6th young master once said that once we find a good seedling, we should recruit them. After all, our cavalrymen are still too weak. So, you know what I mean. Of course, Yenda understood. He even knew that killing a person was not as good as finding a more suitable talent. It would also add more points in the 6th young master's heart. Yes, Commander is right. According to the intelligence, the Nuzan is the leader of the cavalrymen. Furthermore, they are the elites among them. Naturally, their strength is not bad. If Commander needs it, I am willing to take the first company to test them. Don't worry, I know my limits. Before you make the final decision, I will try my best not to hurt them. Yenda wanted to test himself. This was also to gauge the other party's strength. There was a saying that went, "What do you think is false, but seeing is believing?" Okay, you go. Be careful. Oh, right, if necessary, you can use a gun. Use tranquilizer bullets. Su Yunsheng thought for a while and instructed. The tranquilizer bullets he spoke of were naturally the ones in the warehouse. After the finished product was sent to the arsenal in Crimson City, after a lot of effort, the finished product was finally produced. However, due to the scarcity of the materials, not all armies were equipped with them. Currently, only a few special units were using them. Sometimes the scouts would be equipped with some when they wanted to catch tongues alive. However, there were not many of them, since Su Yunsheng said that tranquilizer bullets could be used at critical times. Just this point alone was enough to show how much he valued these hundreds of Nuzin cavalrymen. Okay, you can use them. Yan smiled confidently and left on his horse. He called for 100 brothers of the first company to charge into the battlefield with him. Like Su Yunsheng, Yella also looked at the battlefield with furrowed brows. He was very clear about the standard of Lu Dai's 300 cavalrymen. Although their combat strength was not as good as his, they barely had half of his combat strength. However, even with half of their combat strength, they still did not gain any advantage. Instead, they suffered quite a bit. This made him re-evaluate the strength of the 5-star army. It was at this time that he saw the 100 cavalrymen led by Yen to enter the battlefield. Humph! Yella snorted coldly. They want to interfere in the battlefield in front of me. Men, send 100 cavalrymen to test their strength. Su Yunsheng did not move. Yella also did not move. Both sides reserved a certain amount of combat strength in preparation for the final battle. Yen led the soldiers of the first company onto the battlefield. However, they did not intend to help Commander Guan Zhong deal with Lu Dai. Instead, they moved towards Yella's troops. When he noticed that the enemy had also sent out 100 cavalrymen, Commander Yenda laughed loudly. Brothers, the enemy has also made a move. Looks like we can have some fun. Come, the commander said, to try not to kill as much as possible. Let's see who can capture more tongues, living and useful enemies. The scouts of the first company immediately became excited. To be able to become a scout, there was no need to mention their skills and horsemanship, unless they were surrounded by enemies several times their size. Otherwise, even if they could not defeat the enemy, they could still retreat unscathed. And now that it was only one-on-one, there was even less of a difficulty. Many of the soldiers even began to put away their cavalry swords and rub their fists. Since they wanted to capture the enemy alive, the sharp cavalry swords naturally had to be put away. They were all confident in their horsemanship. They believed that they could get close to the enemy without being injured and then capture the enemy with a single hand. Different from the 3 divisions who had just expanded their forces, the scouts still chose the seedlings of the cold front even though they were expanding from the company to the battalion. In other words, the 100 people who came out to fight this time were all cold front soldiers, and they were all experienced cold front soldiers. Not only were they very good at teamwork, but they were also very good at martial arts. Few people could be their match. And when these 100 cold front soldiers entered the battlefield, it was only a nightmare for the enemy. The moment they saw the Nuzin cavalrymen charging towards them, these 100 people began to perform all kinds of horse tricks. Some hid their bodies on the side of the war horse. Some completely climbed on the horse and became one with it. Some only had one foot on the stirrups and were ready to pounce at any time. In short, the 100 cavalrymen performed all kinds of difficult horse tricks. The Nuzin cavalrymen were indeed quite capable. Facing the actions of the first company of scouts, many of them also began to play tricks. They also performed all kinds of difficult tricks on their horses and then quickly closed in on the enemy. Both sides seemed to have a tacit understanding, and that was to try their best not to use their cavalry swords. They wanted to see whose horsemanship was better and whose horse skills were better. They wanted to see who could capture who in the end. This kind of battle could only be done by those who were extremely confident. Just from this point alone, these 100 Nuzin cavalrymen could be considered elites. The enemy had sent out all their elites, and were full of confidence in their own martial arts. A great battle that was similar to catching a thief on horseback was about to begin. In the distance, the horse trap, a way to catch wild horses and later used to trap the enemy on the horse attacks. When they got close, it simply became a fight where you grab and I dodge, and I grab and you dodge. All of this happened in the instant when the two horses crossed paths. Speaking of lassoing attacks, it was clear that the Nuzen cavalry was better at it. Their lassoing was fast and accurate, and a few scouts were caught because they could not dodge in time or were not used to such an attack. This made Su Yunxing frown as he watched all of this happen. The good thing was that when it came to close combat and capturing people, the scouts were better. They were also used to capturing enemies at close range. Furthermore, to be a member of Cold Vanguard, which one of them wasn't strong and agile, this allowed them to capture more than 10 Jurchen cavalry in a very short period of time, turning the tide of the battle around. Chapter 667. Seeing more than 10 of his men being captured alive, Yella's expression turned ugly. He finally started to take the cavalry of the 5-star army seriously. He originally thought that, in terms of horsemanship, the Nuzen cavalry would be the best. Even the Mongol cavalry would be inferior to them. But now, it seemed that he was too arrogant. Attack together! Draw your swords! Seeing that the 5-star army was very strong, the situation would get worse if they continued to fight. Yella did not want to wait any longer. He did not know if Commander Sun Hong and the rest had already started fighting with the 5-star army. What he needed to do now was to meet up with the main force of the army. Yi La unsheathed his saber, and the 200 female cavalrymen beside him did the same. The 200 of them hollered and pressed their legs against the horse's abdomen, charging forward while yelling, "Follow me and stop them." Su Yunsheng, who had been staring at Yella for a long time, had "I knew you would do" this expression on his face. He took the lead and took out the 95 style from his back. Then he mounted his horse and charged into the battlefield. Firing immediately was the new requirement that Yang Qindong gave to the Cold Vanguard soldiers. Since the next step was to fight on horseback, how to steadily fire and hit the target at high speed became the main training direction for the Cold Vanguard soldiers. Some of the requirements sounded easy, but they were quite difficult to fulfill. For example, firing immediately was something that only a few people in the reconnaissance battalion could do. They were able to hit the target while on a moving horse. Coincidentally, Su Yunsheng, as the battalion commander, was a soldier with this level of skill. As the war horse moved forward, Su Yunsheng held his gun and slowed his breathing. After he got used to the bumpy ride of the war horse, his right index finger moved slightly. Then a bullet was fired from the gun barrel. The bullet flew straight towards Yiladeo, who was waving his saber as he charged forward. He did not hurt anyone because Su Yunxing thought highly of Yella's ability. To be able to train cavalry that could compete with the scouts, this kind of person was definitely a talent. This was also what the 6th young master needed. Bah! After a very unexpected gunshot, Yila, who was running on his horse, felt his right arm sink. When he looked up instinctively, his eyes were filled with horror. He didn't know when, but there was a big gap on the sword in his hand, and the blade was about to break. Who? Su Yunsheng, who fired the shot, was also secretly thankful for his luck. After a period of training, after wasting a lot of bullets, he could now hit a target on a moving horse. However, for an object as thin as a blade, the probability of hitting it was still very low. 1 out of 5 shots was already the limit. For this shot to hit, there was more or less an element of luck involved. Su Yunsheng secretly thought that he was lucky, but in Yi Lei's eyes it really shocked him. Since the other party was able to hit his saber with a gun, wouldn't it be easier for him to kill him? How could the 5-star army's marksmanship be so good? Where did they come from? After becoming a chiliarch of Baiming, Yila more or less had a certain understanding of guns. However, from what he knew, Baiming's guns were extremely low in terms of stability and accuracy. Only the legendary mercenaries of the Duke of Loyalty's mercenaries were truly powerful, and they could fight against 10 or even 100 enemies. Could it be that the other party was using the world's most advanced guns? The thought only flashed through his mind for a moment. Yi La, who had already started his charge, didn't have time to think too much, although he was indeed frightened. What if the other party was just coincidentally stunned? Moreover, he didn't think that the other party would intentionally hold back when they had the ability to kill him. They didn't have any relationship, so why would they do that? Quick, be careful. They have guns in their hands. We can only gain an advantage if we get close to them. Charge with me. After a short moment of hesitation, Yi La's shout rang out again. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind, and that was to charge in front of the other party, cut them down from their horses, and then snatch the guns in their hands. That way, he would be able to gain a great merit. The Nuzan cavalry could be said to be built by Yi La himself. He had invested all of his wealth and energy into it. The other people could name these 300 cavalry, and they treated each other like brothers. When he gave the order, they naturally rushed forward and surrounded Yang Qindong's troops from dozens of directions. They were either holding horse ropes in their hands or making a flying action, as if they wanted to capture the 5-star army alive. Interesting. Su Yunsheng, who had fired a shot, saw that the other party had the same idea as him. They actually wanted to capture him alive. He couldn't help but smile, and his heart was filled with joy. Obviously, the other party had also taken a fancy to his extraordinary skills, and even his weapon. They wanted to take it for their own use. Since both of them had such thoughts, then let's see whose methods were more brilliant. Come on, prepare the tranquilizer bullets. Don't be afraid of wasting them. As long as we can capture these people alive, I will report back the amount of bullets used. The more he saw the performance of the Nuzan cavalry, the more Su Yunsheng was certain of the strength of these people. They were definitely first-class elite soldiers, especially their horse skills. It was obvious that, compared to them, they were even stronger than the Windchaser cavalry regiment. If these people could be used for their own purposes, the mercenary cavalry strength was very likely to increase by half a level or even more. The 6th young master had once said that talent was always the most important thing. Based on this sentence, they had only used up some tranquilizer bullets. No matter how they looked at it, they had profited greatly. The scouts were still having a headache from the other party's superb performance on the horse. They originally thought that their horse strength was very strong, but when they really compared, they realized that they still had too many shortcomings. When facing such a strong opponent, they couldn't help but feel a little lacking in confidence. Now that the camp commander had given the order to use the tranquilizer guns, they didn't have to worry about killing these elites. At that moment, everyone didn't hold back anymore. One by one, they took out their precious tranquilizer bullets and loaded them into their guns. They skillfully aimed, adjusted their breathing, and fired steadily. This series of actions was done naturally and smoothly. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. Gunshots rang out continuously. Without any misgivings, bullets flew out of the barrels and into the bodies and horses of the Nuzan cavalrymen who were trying to get close, and in reality were indeed very close to them. Originally, everyone still appreciated each other and wanted to control each other for their own use. This was the reason why they didn't start a fight as soon as they saw each other. But now, suddenly, the 5-star army started firing, seeing their trusted subordinates trembling a few times after being shot. They fell to the ground with a plop. None of them could get up anymore. Yella's face started to turn cold, until it was terrifyingly deep. Use the bows and arrows. Don't care so much. Kill, kill. His brothers died one by one in front of him. Yella's patience and tolerance disappeared at this moment. In exchange, he was filled with endless anger and terrifying, murderous intent. Yella was finally serious. He didn't want to capture prisoners of war anymore. He wanted to pay blood with blood. But at this moment, Yella's reaction was still a little slow. Just as he gave the order, the Nuzen cavalry picked up their bows one by one. The number of people who were able to pull the strings of their bows could be counted on 2 hands. In a very short period of time, Yella, who had lost most of his combat power, led less than 10 Nuzen cavalry to start a counterattack. They also displayed their martial arts on horseback to the extreme. Even in the face of continuous fire, these people relied on their nimble bodies to make all kinds of evasive maneuvers, causing the bullets to miss one after another. At the same time, they were also looking for opportunities to release arrows to counterattack. In a short period of time, 7 scouts had been hit by arrows, falling to the ground after being hit by the arrows or being hit by their horses. Yella only brought less than 10 cavalrymen. To be precise, there were only 9 of them. There were only 10 of them, and the first wave of counterattacks hit 7 of the scouts. The hit rate was 70%, which was a rather high standard. Bang, bang, bang. Using the short period of time when the enemy finished firing the arrows, another 5 Nuzen cavalry were shot and fell from their horses. Yella, who only had 4 cavalrymen by his side, roared and cursed. Then he turned around and left very straightforwardly. After seeing the accurate marksmanship and powerful firearms of the 5-star army, he knew that it was impossible to win with the amount of people he had now. Since that was the case, he left and remembered this hatred in his heart and looked for an opportunity to take revenge. Yi La wanted to leave, but how could Su Yunxing allow it? He shouted and gave chase. He himself rode his horse and chased after Yi La. Anesthetizing the enemy was only a method. If he really wanted to persuade them to work for him, he knew that all hope fell on the enemy's chiliarch. As long as he captured this person alive, there was a high possibility of subduing the cavalrymen. Otherwise, the problem would be difficult to solve. With a clear goal, Su Yunxing brought a squad of elite scouts and chased after Yella. A squad of scouts just to deal with a single cavalryman. This was extremely rare in the history of Yangxia's scouts. It was also destined that Yella would not be able to escape. Yella's horse skills were indeed very good. His horse was also not an ordinary warhorse. It seemed to be psychic. It seemed to know its master's intentions and rushed out of the encirclement of the scouts several times when it was extremely dangerous. Yella's warhorse was well protected. It was covered with a layer of armor. Even the head was covered. Although the weight would reduce the warhorse's running speed, because its entire body was covered in armor, it would give a feeling of being unable to attack. Even if the gun hit the armor, it would not be able to penetrate it. However, the powerful recoil made the warhorse feel pain and neighed. Chapter 668. Yi La's face darkened as he felt the rage of the warhorse beneath him. His face was also dark, as if he could explode at any moment and kill someone in anger. When he thought of the elite cavalry that he had painstakingly built over the years being killed one by one in such a short period of time, he wanted nothing more than to fight the 5-star army with his life on the line. While he was furious, he was also trying his best to suppress it. He knew that the current situation was not in his favor. If he wanted to fight with his life on the line, he might be able to kill a few opponents, but he would have to leave his life here. Death was no longer something he was afraid of. He was afraid that after he died, no one would be able to avenge him and his brothers, so he could only endure. Under the siege of 10 people, even the chainmail could not protect him. The warhorse kept neighing as it was injured, but he ignored it all. Relying on his black armor and exquisite skills, he commanded the warhorse to charge out of the battlefield. What he saw from the corner of his eyes made him clench his teeth again. It was not for anything else, but because the 5 bodyguards that followed him were also hit by the 5-star army and fell from their warhorses. This time, the 300 riders he had brought with him had all been annihilated, and he was the only one left. This made him even more determined to escape, so that he could rise again and take revenge. Battalion commander, this guy is slippery. His perception is very strong, and our bullets did not hit him. His warhorse is also wearing armor, and his body is also protected by black armor. Our bullets can't penetrate it. What should we do? The accompanying squad leader rode to Su Yunqing's side with a bitter expression. Battalion commander, he is going to charge out. Another vice squad leader in the team suddenly shouted. He looked up and saw Yi La and his horse charging out from the area that the squad leader was guarding. It seemed that he was really going to charge out of the encirclement. Once he got out of here, he would throw away the armor on his warhorse. His speed would greatly increase, and it would be very difficult to catch him. No way. Watch this battalion commander. Su Yunqing's expression did not change, and his heart did not panic. He raised the 95 style in his hand and turned on the burst shooting mode. Then he aimed at the black horse's leg and fired 5 shots in a row. As expected of the battalion commander of the reconnaissance battalion, and as expected of one of the earliest people to follow the 6th young master, after wasting countless bullets, his marksmanship finally reached a certain level. Out of the 5 bullets he fired, 2 of them actually landed on the same area. Although it was not a single spot, both of them were on the right hind leg of the warhorse. When the 2 bullets hit the same area, the result was obvious. Although the bullets couldn't penetrate the horse, each bullet hit the horse's hind leg. In the end, the horse couldn't withstand the force. Its right leg went soft, and it fell to the ground with a plop. Yi La, who wasn't prepared, or perhaps he was very confident in his armor, was thrown out. He was separated from his warhorse and flew 3 meters before landing on the ground. At the crucial moment, Yi La did a forward roll. Just as he landed on the ground, his body had already flown out. Then he continued to run forward for dozens of steps before he suddenly turned around. A bow and arrow appeared in his hand. The black arrowhead flashed with the light of death. He pulled the bow and arrow back to shoot the enemy. Yi La had no choice but to stop. Without the help of his warhorse, how could his speed be faster than those mounted scouts? Since he couldn't escape, he might as well fight. Killing 1 would be enough, and killing 2 would be worth it. The strong bow was already drawn, and his killing intent was already locked onto the body of the 5-star army scout. Then his mouth revealed a bloodthirsty smile. But just as this smile bloomed, he felt a sudden pain in his right arm. Then his whole body began to lose strength. His eyes began to dim, and the bow and arrow slipped from his hand. Before he could shoot anyone, he had already fallen to the ground and fainted. More than 200 meters away, Su Yunqing slowly put away the tranquilizer gun. He smiled and said, "Okay, tie them up and bring them back." This time, it could be said that the results were not bad. After wasting thousands of tranquilizer bullets, they captured more than 500 Bai Ming cavalrymen, including Yi La and Lu Dai. They were personally escorted by Su Yunqing towards the 5-star army's base camp. At the base camp, one by one, the battle reports were sent to Yang Qindong. Beta Persei, who was responsible for delivering the information, had a straight face. Don't think that it was because he had matured and won many battles that he wasn't arrogant. In fact, it was just because he didn't have the chance to go to the battlefield this time that he was in a bad mood. As Yang Qindong's forces grew bigger and bigger, his authority naturally became more and more important. There were not many people who dared to throw a tantrum in front of him, and there might even be none left. Beta Persei must be an exception. When he was happy, he would show it on his face. When he was angry, he would also show it on his face. In other words, as long as it didn't affect his work, his face would express his true feelings at this moment. However, Yang Qindong had never reprimanded him. Maybe it was because he thought it was fun, or maybe he liked Beta Persei's honest appearance. In short, when Beta Persei was angry, he never got angry. Instead, he always looked at him with interest. At one point, Beta Persei couldn't vent his anger. Instead, he would feel embarrassed from being looked at. In the end, his anger naturally dissipated. "Young master, if there's a chance next time, can you let me have some fun?" Even Tigerhead is leading troops. After holding it in for a long time, Beta Persei finally couldn't hold it in anymore. While handing over another battlefield briefing, he finally said what was on his mind. Yang Qindong didn't even raise his head as he looked at the battlefield report in his hand seriously. If you want to lead troops, you can choose a battalion and be a battalion commander first. If you perform well, it won't be difficult for you to become a regiment commander. Ah, young master, you agreed. Hearing that he could finally lead troops, and a battalion commander at that, Beta Persei's face suddenly bloomed with a smile. Yes, I agreed. If you agree, you can now hand over to Qiu Vi and Dao Zhao's teams and leave. Yang Qindong finally raised his head and looked at Beta Persei, who was standing there foolishly, with a smile on his face. Okay, no. Beta Persei smiled and kept nodding, but then he seemed to have thought of something and immediately shook his head like a rattle drum. Beta Persei will follow young master, forever by young master's side. Beta Persei finally reacted. With his experience of following Yang Qindong all this time, being a battalion commander in the army would not be considered an important position. On the contrary, it would be a very normal thing. With his status and experience, even if he were to become a regiment commander, no one would say anything about it. But once he really left the army, it would be very difficult for him to return to Yang Qindong's side. This was definitely something he could not accept. Beta Persei did not forget what kind of role he, Yang San, Yang Si, Yang Wu, and Yang Lu had when they came to Yang Qindong's side. They were the Yang family servants, protecting the 6th young master's safety and also responsible for some of the Yang family's affairs. This was their duty and pursuit. But now, if he wanted to go to the battlefield, he would have to violate his original promise and goal. This was equivalent to betraying his own life. This was something Beta Persei would not allow to happen. But after a moment of joy, he suddenly thought of these things. He remembered that the 6th young master had said that he could leave after handing over his work. Did that mean that he would not be able to come back? Compared to being by the 6th young master's side to protect his safety, not to mention being a battalion commander, even being a regiment commander or a division commander would not be enough to move him. Beta Persei suddenly went back on his word. Yang Qindong's expression did not change, but he asked very seriously, I just said that I agree. If you agree, you can leave now. No, young master, I don't agree. I'm going back on my word. I want to stay by the young master's side for the rest of my life and protect your safety with my life, Beta Persei said in a resolute tone. Then, with a plop, he knelt on the ground and kowtowed. Sigh. Beta Persei knelt on the ground. Yang Qindong shook his head helplessly, then raised his hand and said, Well, since this is your choice, I respect you. Then stay. It's just that I don't want to hear the same words a second time. If you have such thoughts again next time, then just leave. Do you understand? Understood, young master. Don't worry, I won't have such thoughts in my life. Beta Persei kowtowed 3 more times to the ground before he slowly raised his head and breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that the young master was not angry with him for saying these words. It seemed that he needed to go back and reflect on himself. Being able to stay by the 6th young master's side was something that many people wished for. He actually wanted more. He really did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Beta Persei stood up again. Yang Qindong was no longer looking at him. Instead, he placed the battlefield briefing in front of him. Well, take a look. Battalion Commander Su said that this Ming general called Yella has some skills. You can fight with him later and find out what abilities he has. As soon as he heard that there was a fight, a smile reappeared on Beta Persei's face. Okay. Please rest assured, young master. I will definitely teach him a good lesson later. He. The battle was won, and the dispatched troops returned one after another. Yang Qindong rode the white dragon horse and stood at the gate of the barracks with a group of people to welcome the victorious army. When any army passed by him, They would salute him solemnly as a sign of respect. Smoke was already rising in the barracks. The 2 auxiliary barracks that were left behind had already cooked fragrant food and were waiting to reward the army. The soldiers who entered the barracks first handed over their spoils of war, the noses of the dead enemies, to the officers who recorded their achievements. Then they took the silver that had sunk into the ground and happily washed their hands to eat. The barracks was soon filled with people and all kinds of laughter. Chapter 669. In the Battle of Liao River, they killed more than 3,000 enemies and captured more than 6,000 enemies. They also seized countless war horses and various resources. The 5-star army only suffered less than 100 casualties. In the Battle of Cold Weapons, it could already be considered an absolute victory. Troops and prisoners of war entered the barracks one after another, including Su Yunqing's troops. Yella was still unconscious after being hit by the tranquilizer gun. However, his war horse had already recovered and was brought in front of Yang Qindong. "Oh, this armor is not bad." Looking at the armor that completely covered the war horse, Yang Qindong's interest was piqued. "Yes, 6th young master, this armor is indeed very powerful. Ordinary bullets won't be able to do much damage to it." Su Yunqing stood at the side and described the situation on the battlefield in detail. Yang Qindong nodded his head as he listened. He had a thoughtful expression on his face. "Men, bring Wu Hua over." Wu Hua, the blacksmith who specialized in making saddles and armor for war horses, came in front of Yang Qindong. As soon as he arrived, he didn't wait for anyone to ask him and walked in front of the war horse. He carefully observed it and then touched it with his hands. His face flashed with excitement, like a young lad who saw a beautiful girl. He loved it so much that he couldn't bear to part with it. "All right, you've seen and touched it. Tell me, can you make a war horse armor like this?" Yang Qindong chuckled as he rode on the white dragon horse. "I can. However, it requires a lot of materials. This kind of iron isn't ordinary iron. It has been tempered thousands of times. Let's put it this way. After 100 gene of iron is tempered, it's already not bad if 5 gene is usable. After all, considering the toughness and weight of the iron, there can't be any impurities." Wu Hua, who already had an idea in his heart, turned around and reported to Yang Qindong respectfully. 5%? Yes, that is indeed necessary." Yang Qindong nodded in agreement. Su Yunqing had said that the warhorse's speed didn't decrease significantly because of the iron. This was enough to prove the strength of the iron. This was also the point that he valued the most. Of course, this also meant that a large amount of iron was required to make such armor. Even with Yang Qindong's wealth, it was impossible to equip all the warhorses with such armor. Even though the amount of steel that Crimson Nest City had prepared over the past few years wasn't small, both the weapon factories and the shipyards required an extremely large amount. Not to mention, when Yang Qindong left, there was a new factory, a tank factory, which required even more materials. It was impossible for him to have any spare energy to support the creation of the warhorse chainmail. "Looks like I'll have to figure everything out myself." However, the amount of iron needed to build a cavalry of over 10,000 men is also enough to make one sai. Yang Qindong's thought of equipping all the warhorses was immediately extinguished. Knowing that it was impossible to do it, but insisting on it wasn't a firm decision, but a fool. "How about this? Take out all the iron we have. This young master will think of a way to obtain some from the surroundings. It shouldn't be a problem to equip 100 men's squad first." Yang Qindong quickly made a decision, and his gaze landed on Wu Hua. If possible, he planned to equip his 2 guards first. That way, his safety would be guaranteed, and the other officers wouldn't have to worry about him when he went anywhere. The number of security squads on both sides has been expanded from the original 30 to 50 people per squad. As long as there are enough materials, I can lead the blacksmiths to create the chainmail. Wu Hua had a face full of confidence. Interest was the best teacher. He had been learning blacksmithing from his father since birth and now had over 30 years of experience. It wasn't that he wasn't capable enough to produce anything good, but that the conditions and environment didn't allow him to do so. However, if there were enough materials, he was confident that the chainmail he produced wouldn't be inferior to anyone else's. All right, then it's settled. Not only do we have the iron horse chainmail, there's also an impenetrable black armor over there. Let's forge them all, ha ha ha. Yang Qindong laughed heartily in satisfaction. Then he touched the chainmail affectionately and sighed with longing. In the camp, the soldiers had a warm meal and everyone was refreshed. The commanders of the various battalions and companies also took the opportunity to start targeted training. They were given remedial training based on their performance in the previous battle so that they could have a better performance in the next battle. The captives were gathered together and given a full meal. When they saw that there was meat in the dishes and that there was a lot of meat, they actually ate to their heart's content. For a moment, they seemed to have forgotten that they were captives. Yi La and Lu Dai were also among them. When they saw that their subordinates were still alive and wolfing down the food, they couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. In order for the Nuzin tribe to have the ability to protect themselves in the future, although one of them was a Qianhu captain and the other was a Qianhu vice Qianhu captain, they had been living in poverty all these years. All the money was spent on equipment and training, so they rarely ate meat. The clansmen had never complained. It wasn't that they didn't have any ideas, but that they knew that the hardship they suffered now was so that their clansmen could live a more free life in the future. Now that they had become captives, there was no future for them, so they might as well eat to their heart's content. A trace of tears flowed out of Yi Le's eyes. After recalling the scene, he knew that he had let down his soldiers too much. However, at the same time, he was very happy. He thought that his brothers would be killed in front of him and that they would be separated by life and death. He didn't expect that when he woke up, his brothers would still be alive. At most, they were a little injured, but not a single one of them had died. This made him very happy, but at the same time, he was very curious about what methods the 5-star army used and how they did it. Yi La and Lu Dai, my young master wants to see you. Su Yunxing appeared in front of the captive camp. After seeing that the two of them had finished eating and had put down their bowls and chopsticks, he shouted. As soon as he finished speaking, the 500 captives all stood up, regardless of whether they were full or not. They all stood up in unison and glared at Su Yunxing with ferocious gazes. Although they didn't have any weapons in their hands, they still had their fists, legs, and teeth. As long as they were still breathing, they wouldn't let anyone threaten the safety of the two generals. Su Yunsheng saw the collective performance of the Nuzin cavalry and praised them in his heart. Just from this point, he could see that the two generals should be loved and respected by their soldiers. Wasn't this the talent that the 6th young master needed? All right, I'm not bringing you to interrogate you, not to kill you. Besides, if I really want to kill you, do you think you can stop me? Although Su Yunxing was very optimistic about the Nuzin cavalry, his face was still very serious. Before they submitted to the 6th young master, they were still his enemies. Yi La and Lu Dai understood the meaning behind Su Yunxing's words. Furthermore, they were now under someone else's care. Did they really think that they could not go out just because they wanted to? If they angered the other party, they would only implicate their subordinates. All right, everyone sit down. I'll go out with Chiliarch Lu. Yi La knew that he couldn't make the decision now. Even if he didn't want to, what else could he do? Besides, he also wanted to see who the general of the 5-star army was and how he could train such a powerful cavalry like Su Yunxing. With the two generals speaking, although the soldiers still had some complaints, they couldn't say anything. They could only remind the generals to be careful and watch the two of them walk out of the captive camp. On the way to the main tent with Su Yunxing, Battalion Commander Su whispered to them, "When you see the young master later, please be more respectful. Even if it's not for yourself, for the sake of your brothers and clansmen, please pay attention to your words. Otherwise, no one can save you." Although Su Yunxing knew that the sixth young master loved talented people, if they relied on their talents to become arrogant and even spoke hurtful words, even if the sixth young master was magnanimous and didn't lower himself to their level, who knew what Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei would do. In front of a group of officers who regarded the sixth young master as a god, anyone who dared to do something provocative would have very serious consequences. Yi La and Lu Dai didn't say anything. They didn't agree or disagree. They just obediently followed behind Su Yunxing step by step. In fact, only the two of them knew that if the leader of the 5-star army didn't have the ability, then they would never bow their heads. This was the dignity of the strong. Only a stronger person could subdue them. Otherwise, not only would they surrender, they would also have other thoughts in their hearts. It was only a matter of time before they rebelled. After about 2 miles, Su Yunxing finally stopped and stood in front of a military tent that occupied a large area. As soon as he entered, Yi La felt a murderous aura around him. Lu Dai was a little better. His perception wasn't as strong as Yi La's. He just felt a little uncomfortable. On the other hand, Yi La felt like a lamb that had strayed into the forest and was stared at by a fierce tiger. He couldn't help but become very nervous. About 300 meters away from the military tent, Yang Qindong was watching Yi La and Lu Dai under the cover of another military tent. When he saw the latter lowering his head, he couldn't help but want to look around. The former didn't even raise his head, but his body was tense. It seemed that his body would bend into a bow at any time and he would make the strongest counterattack at any time. Chapter 670. That's Yi La, right? His reaction is pretty good. Yang Qindong pointed casually and asked Guanzhong, the battalion commander of the 3rd Division. Lu Dai was captured by Guanzhong and his men, so he was naturally clear about the situation of these people. Hearing the 6th young master's question, he cupped his fist and said, "Yes, that person is Yi La." When they captured him, Battalion Commander Su took a full squad of soldiers and spent some effort to capture him. Well, he's someone with some strength. Yang Qindong had heard about these things a long time ago, so there was nothing strange about it. This led to the current move of probing. He deliberately arranged for the Wolf Fang Special Forces to ambush near his tent in order to put pressure on the opponent and see how Yi La's perception was. After all, if he wanted to become a general who led troops and was trained to be a general who led an independent team, if he didn't even have the ability to perceive danger, then no one would feel at ease handing over military power to him. Knowing that Yi La's strength was not bad, Yang Qindong turned his head and looked at Beta Persei. "How about it? If your hands are itchy, go and give it a try." "Yes." Beta Persei, who had been impatient for a long time, agreed and walked towards the tent. His tall body seemed to cause a tremor in the ground every time he stepped on the ground. It could be seen that Yang Er's strength had improved during this period of time. Su Yunxing, who was still standing in front of the tent, was not in a hurry at all. His task was to bring these 2 people here. As for what would happen next, it was something he needed to worry about. Yi La and Lu Dai behind him, especially the latter, had been standing there for a long time, but no one came to greet him. This made him very puzzled. He endured it and was about to raise his head and ask Su Yunxing how long he was going to stand there. As soon as Lu Dai raised his head, he felt a murderous aura appear beside him. Lu Dai hurriedly turned around and saw Yang Er, who was only 5 meters away from him. With a height of nearly 9 meters, and a weight of more than 100 kilograms, no one could ignore him standing there. When Lu Dai saw him, for some reason, he instinctively made a defensive move. Beta Persei saw all of this. No, my opponent is him." Yang Er shook his head in disdain when he saw Lu Dai staring at him with a defensive expression. He spoke in an arrogant tone. No matter what, he was still a vice chiliarch, and he had the bloodline of the Nuzin clan. When had he ever been looked down upon like this? Lu Dai raised his head and glared fiercely at Beta Persei. He opened his mouth and said, You're very arrogant, but you have to know that you're not good at fighting just because you're big. If you have the ability, let's fight. I'll let you know the consequences of being frivolous. Arrogant. Yang Er laughed out loud. Originally, you weren't qualified enough for me to deal with you. However, since you're so arrogant, then come at me. Let's see who's the arrogant one here. After he finished speaking, Yang Shou hooked his finger at Lu Dai, making a provocative gesture that seemed to be asking for a beating. This gesture was naturally learned from Yang Qindong. At that time, it was this gesture that was so awesome, awe-inspiring, cool. It was also because of this gesture that the first and second guard teams were completely wiped out. Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei were also defeated and lying on the ground. Until now, the Wolf Fong Special Forces were also completely wiped out. This was Yang Qindong's strength. However, no one knew if this was his true strength, because now no one could test the bottom line of the sixth young master. Everyone only knew that once this gesture was made, these people combined were no longer his opponent. Imitating the sixth young master, Beta Persei also made the same gesture, which aroused Lu Dai's anger. Although he didn't know what this gesture meant, the contempt and disdain in Beta Persei's eyes were undoubtedly revealed. Since this was the case, of course, he would make a move. He wanted to let this arrogant person know what the consequences of daring to underestimate him were. Aha! With a shout, Lu Dai's feet constantly kicked up dust on the ground. He had just eaten and was now full of strength, coupled with his anger. His speed was even faster than usual. After running for 7 or 8 steps, Lu Dai, who had accumulated enough power, suddenly leaped into the air and smashed his fist down on Yang Er's head with the force of Mount Tai. Humph! Lu Dai's eyes were fixed on the other party's body. When Lu Dai leaped up, Yang Er let out a disdainful snort. Then, without any movement, he tilted his head, causing the fist to hit empty air. The fist smashed down on the corner of his clothes. Lu Dai's face did not change in the slightest when his attack failed. Originally, he did not expect this punch to succeed. This was originally a probing move, and the next kick was his real killer move. His body rotated in midair, and his right leg kicked out towards Beta Persei's head. The speed of this move was so fast that even Beta Persei could not dodge it. Since he could not dodge, Beta Persei simply tilted his head again, then raised his right arm to block his more vulnerable neck. Clang! The kick landed squarely on Beta Persei's forearm. The powerful force caused Lu Dai's body to tremble, and he retreated several steps. At this moment, there was a trace of pain on his face. This time he was the first to attack, but when this kick landed on Beta Persei's arm, it was as if he had kicked a thick iron plate. It brought him endless pain, causing the corners of his mouth to twitch. Still want to leave? Seeing that Lu Dai, who had failed in his attack, wanted to land and retreat again after the kick, Beta Persei was not willing to agree. He did not make a move before because he wanted to test the opponent's ability. Now that he knew the opponent's approximate strength, it was time for him to counterattack. With a roar, Beta Persei's right arm suddenly grabbed forward, accurately grabbing Lu Dai's ankle in his hand. Then his body suddenly spun on the spot, forcibly lifting Lu Dai's body into the air. You can go now. After spinning for more than half a circle, Beta Persei felt that Lu Dai's entire body was spinning with his body. He suddenly loosened his grip, and the figure flew forward like an arrow. Puff! After about a breath's time, Lu Dai's entire body was smashed to the ground. At that moment, he felt as if all the bones in his body had fallen apart, and there was nothing but pain. This was because Beta Persei had controlled his strength. Otherwise, this throw would have smashed him to death. After Lu Dai was thrown out, Beta Persei regained his footing. He clapped his hands and said with an indifferent look, "Okay, the noisy person is gone. Now you can fight with me." His gaze fell on Yi La. Beta Persei clenched his fists, producing a creaking sound. Yi La saw the scene just now from the beginning to the end. Because of this, he did not dare to underestimate Beta Persei. On the contrary, he was constantly evaluating him in his heart. In the end, he shook his head and said in an unwilling and sad tone, "I'm not your opponent." Oh, Beta Persei, who was preparing for a big fight, suddenly froze after hearing Yi La's words. This was inconsistent with the task given by the young master. After thinking for a while, he turned to look in the direction where Yang Qindong was standing. At this time, Yang Qindong was striding over and happened to hear Yi La's answer. Compared to other people who would show a look of suspicion or even contempt, Yang Qindong's expression did not change. On the contrary, if one looked carefully, there was a trace of joy. In this era, people who could ride horses on the battlefield all boasted that they were men. Each and every one of them had their eyes on the top of their heads. When it came to a bloody battle, it was about who had more people, who had more strength, and who dared to fight to the death. On the contrary, there were very few people like Yi La who admitted that they were inferior to others in terms of strength. But because there were very few of them, it was abrupt and even looked down on by most people. As a northern Ming guard 1,000 households, admitting defeat before the battle was naturally a sign of cowardice in their eyes. It was a cowardly act. This Yi La doesn't seem to be as strong as Battalion Commander Su said. Tiger's Mane was the first to assert. Not only him, but the first guard, Captain Chiu Vi, and the second guard, Captain Dao Shao, also nodded in agreement. It's important to know one's own name. This is the ability that a commander should have. Without waiting for others to mock him, Yang Qindong suddenly opened his mouth. Instantly, Tiger's Mane and the others' expressions changed. The laughter that was about to come out was stuck in their throats. Ignoring the wonderful changes in the expressions of the people around him, Yang Qindong strode in front of Yi La and looked at him with interest. "Well, you admit defeat before the battle. Do you know that people will look down on you if you do this?" Yang Qindong did not reveal his identity, so Yi La did not ask. But he could still see that although the person who asked the question was young, he was indeed surrounded by people like the stars around the moon. His identity must not be simple. Out of politeness, he replied, "It doesn't matter if people look down on us or not. We live for ourselves, not in the eyes of others." Interesting. Hearing this answer, Yang Qindong seemed to be even more interested. "But I don't know why you admitted defeat directly. Don't you have the courage to even try?" Yi La had already said that he did not want to live in the eyes of others, but Yang Qindong brought up this matter again. Yi La was too lazy to answer. He turned his head away and looked like he was unwilling to answer. This was heard by Su Yunsheng, who was standing at the side. He was afraid that the sixth young master would be angry, so he quickly whispered, "Yi La, don't be arrogant. This is our sixth young master, and also the great Ming's loyal duke." Chapter 671. Su Yunsheng was aware of Yi La's abilities, so he reminded him out of kindness. However, Yi La didn't seem to appreciate it. "What do you mean by don't be arrogant? What do you mean by our sixth young master? He's clearly yours, okay? And what about the great Ming's loyal duke? What the hell is that? Loyal duke? Ah, loyal duke?" Yella, who was half a beat slower in reaction, changed her expression and looked at Yang Qindong again. She then asked with a shocked expression, "What did you say? Did you just say that you're the Duke of Loyalty of the great Ming dynasty? Are you the war god's loyal duke?" It was no wonder that Yi La was so shocked. Although New Gandusi was far away from Bai Ming's capital, they had heard about the war god's continuous victories and how he forced the Walla's army to retreat. The female Jinren prided herself as the strongest person in this era, so she naturally respected the strongest people. When he heard the news, he had thought more than once that he must meet the war god if he had the chance. He didn't expect that his wish would come true today. Yi La stood in front of Yang Qindong in shock. His eyes kept looking at Yang Qindong. He found that the god of war was very young and had a scholarly aura. He didn't seem to know any martial arts at all. Was he really the god of war? He didn't know that Yang Qindong could hide his murderous aura under the nourishment of the qi. He had reached the realm of returning to his original state. Unless he wanted to let the other party know. Otherwise, no one would be able to tell how much power was contained in his seemingly scholarly body just by looking at his appearance. There's no need to look. If you're talking about how I defeated the Walla, then I'm the war god you're talking about. Yang Qindong squinted his eyes and smiled. You are really the god of war, but they say that the god of war has 3 heads, 6 arms, a height of more than 1 zhang, and arms as thick as an ordinary person's thigh. Yi La spat out all the words he had heard in the rumors. Ha ha, ha ha ha. Yang Qindong couldn't help but laugh when he heard Yi La's description of himself. Not only that, but Tiger's man, Beta Persei, and the others also laughed. They had been with the 6th young master for the longest time, so they naturally knew what kind of person the 6th young master was. After laughing for a while, Yang Qindong finally stopped laughing when he saw the doubt in Yi La's eyes getting heavier and heavier. He said, You're saying that I have 3 heads and 6 arms, right? But in fact, I am a very normal person, just like all of you. But you should also know that even if it is a legend, if it is not exaggerated, who would be willing to listen to it and believe it? In the last sentence, Yang Qindong told the truth. There was always no lack of exaggeration in history. It seemed that when you said that a person was very powerful, you had to exaggerate infinitely. This had become a law. But in fact, those famous people in history had only 1 head and 2 shoulders. Before they became famous, they were no different from ordinary people. Yi La also laughed at this time, but it was an awkward laugh. He was a smart person, but he was still misled. This was enough to show how powerful the legend was. Even he had to believe it. Seeing Yi La's forced smile, Yang Qindong casually waved his hand, indicating that he didn't want to talk about this topic anymore. He then said, I heard from Battalion Commander Su that you and the Nuzin cavalry you lead are very strong, but I don't know why you train so well. Don't say that this is your duty. This young master has already understood that your salary and some gray income is invested in the cavalry. This is not the duty and responsibility of a Qinhu. Yi La had already recovered from the shock. When he heard Yang Qindong's question, he bitterly smiled and said, Before this, I was very confident in my cavalry. But after this battle, I can't say that they are very strong. I am now a captive. As for why I did this, I don't dare to lie. I was just used to being bullied and didn't want my descendants to be inferior. Well said. When Yang Qindong heard the last sentence, he didn't want his descendants to be inferior to others. Yang Qindong was quite emotional and cheered loudly. Of course, he wouldn't tell Yi La that 100 years later in history, the Nuzin people were so powerful that they enslaved the entire Han people for 268 years. They truly fulfilled the fact that their descendants were not inferior and were even superior. Since he knew that the Nuzin people had ambitions and was met by Yang Qindong, of course, he had to strangle this ambition in the cradle. And for insurance, of course, it was best to take them in as his subordinates and keep a close eye on them. Yi La, right? This duke wants to take you in as his subordinate. What do you think? Don't worry, under my command, the Nuzin people can live very freely. As long as they are obedient, they won't have to worry about food and clothing. Living a happy life is not a problem. Yang Qindong made a promise and stared at Yi La's body. At this time, the Nuzin people were still very weak. Not to mention the great Ming dynasty, they were even much weaker than the Mongols and Walla. Yang Qindong was willing to help them at this time. This was naturally what Yi La wanted. Yi La, who didn't know what the future would be like, was moved by these words. He was even more clear that if he didn't agree now, he who was originally a captive might not even have the chance to see the sun tomorrow. With a plop, Yi La knelt on the ground and kowtowed 3 times to Yang Qindong. Yi La is willing to lead the Nuzin people to submit to the Duke of Loyalty. I will not regret it until I die. The news of Yang Qindong leading a powerful mercenary army to destroy the Jiaoji and Lancang kingdoms in the south had already spread to the new, or gone city department. As a Qianhu, Yi La had the right to know these things. In his heart, he didn't know how much he envied the strength of the mercenary army. Now that he had the chance to see Yang Qindong himself, he finally made the decision to submit. In his opinion, this decision was the right one. At least for now it was the right one. After accepting another general, Yang Qindong smiled happily. He didn't think that as soon as he revealed his aura, everyone would bow down to him. He was very clear that the reason why Yi La submitted to him was because he saw that he was stronger than him. It could even be said that it was a temporary measure, but it didn't matter. Since he had already submitted, Yang Qindong was confident that he wouldn't let him leave again. If he had to say where his advantage was now, other than the unknown and mysterious warehouse, he should be left with money. With the foundation of Qiqian City, there were so many novel things that were sold at high prices. There was even a price, but no market. He never lacked money. With money, he could buy people's hearts. As long as he didn't do things that hurt people's hearts, it would be difficult for people who followed him to follow others. This thought flashed through his mind. Yi La stood up and followed beside Yang Qindong, starting to patrol the camp together. This was also the first time Yi La saw the strength of the five-star army. When he found out that General Sun Hong's 10,000-strong northern Ming army had been defeated and captured, and that not a single soldier had managed to escape from the battlefield, his face revealed an extremely shocked expression. Yi La was also a proud person. The biggest characteristic of such a person was that he was conceited and didn't want to admit defeat. In his opinion, if he had enough military strength and wealth, he would definitely be able to win. At least, when facing an opponent with similar numbers, he would definitely not lose. However, he had to admit that no matter how conceited he was, if he wanted to use only 600 cavalry to face Sun Hong's 5,000 cavalry, 5,000 paces, he still didn't have the slightest chance of victory. Yang Qindong did it, although this was because he had more than 10,000 soldiers in his hands. However, on such an intense battlefield, to not let a single person escape and to absolutely seal off the news, this still shocked him. At the very least, it would be very difficult for him to do this. Seeing Yi La's shock, Yang Qindong said with a smile, "There's no other way. I am the Duke of Loyalty, personally conferred by the Ming Emperor. It's best not to spread the news of me beating my own people." Yi La couldn't help but tense up. That's right, this is the Duke of Ming. However, even though you knew this, you still didn't hesitate to make a move. I'm afraid you already know what you are thinking in your heart. Of course, this was just a thought in his heart. Right now, Yi La was still a prisoner. Although he said that he had surrendered, who knew if it was true or not? Since he was a newcomer, there were some things that couldn't be said carelessly. While patrolling the barracks, the two chatted. As they talked about the warhorse uniform. Yang Qindong didn't intend to hide anything. He said that he was very satisfied with the impenetrable armor and wanted to imitate it to make some. He also asked about some things that he should pay attention to. There was no secret about the warhorse uniform. This was something that anyone could make after accumulating a certain amount of wealth. It was just that most people didn't have the courage to do so. Yang Qindong wanted to make one, and this one alone was more than 100 sets. Yi La was shocked again, but at the same time he couldn't help but think that this was what it meant to be rich. He didn't even know how much time it took to make a set of his own, but he did it just like that. It was good to be rich. This wasn't a secret to begin with, and he could use this opportunity to express his loyalty. Yi La said that he would look for the blacksmith in the army later and tell him some of the problems he would encounter when making the warhorse uniform. He would try his best to avoid some common mistakes and take fewer detours. Very good. Yang Qindong nodded approvingly. He looked at the barracks on the left and pointed casually. Let's go over there and take a look. Yi La, who was following beside Yang Qindong, naturally nodded in agreement. He only thought that Yang Qindong was showing off his strength and martial prowess, so he didn't think too much about it. However, when he entered the barracks, his expression was no longer as calm as before. At this moment, his face was full of shock. Of course, ever since he had followed Yang Qindong for less than an hour, he had been shocked so many times that he had probably forgotten how many times he had been shocked. Chapter 672. In Yella's line of sight, his clansman, Hulu, was sitting cross-legged on the ground with his back facing him. He was having a meeting with a few generals. Whether it was Yang Qindong or Yella, they had chosen a good vantage point. From here, they could not be seen by the other party and could also hear what they were saying. Therefore, Hulu and his men's words were clearly heard by them. "Battalion commander, I just went to get a new saber." Don't even mention how sharp and tough that thing is. When I used my old saber to fight against it, it only lasted 6 hits before it broke. "Battalion commander, I just used my merit to exchange for silver. After dividing it among the brothers, each of them can get at least 80 silvers. 80 silvers, battalion commander. If it was in the past, I wouldn't have dared to think that we could get so much from a single battle. Battalion commander, when I passed by our logistics carriage just now, I accidentally saw that there were still quite a few military uniforms there. We have already joined the 5-star army. Why don't you ask when you can distribute the military uniforms? The 3 divisions are all wearing the same uniform, and they look very spirited. Battalion commander, this battle was so satisfying and decisive. We didn't suffer any losses, and the merit points were exchanged in such a timely manner. Shouldn't you ask Regiment Commander Windchaser if our battalion should be the vanguard in the next battle? Battalion commander." Yella stood there like a fool. He realized that all he could hear were the soldiers discussing how great the results of this battle were and how they should perform better in the next battle. Some of them were so anxious that they couldn't help but speak the language of the Nazarin. He could understand all of this. He also finally knew that the soldiers in this camp were all Nazarin cavalry. This meant that he wasn't the first Nazarin to join the 5-star army. Of course, Yella was a person with his own pride. He didn't care about this problem. However, the fact that his clansmen had joined the 5-star army, and from the looks of it, they were very sincere, this was far beyond his expectations. With his intelligence, he guessed that the army's predecessor was most likely Borte's troops in Narcissus Town. Yilla naturally knew about Borte. Not only that, but he was also the backer of the Baiming army. Otherwise, the Sa-Cha River Guards and the Calm Garrison were not far from Narcissus Town, so the Baiming army had never made things difficult for them. It was impossible to say that he did not contribute. Yi La had even thought of accepting this army as his subordinates, one day after they had been trained. Narcissus Town wasn't the only Jurchenites without a designation. There were many of them in the vicinity, and they were of different sizes. Yi La was quietly observing them, waiting for the army to be strong enough and experienced enough before he would step forward to recruit them. If he wanted the Jurchenites to become strong and not be bullied by others, he couldn't do it alone. He needed the help of more knowledgeable people. He didn't expect that before he could decide whether to recruit the troops from Narcissus Town, they had already become a part of the 5-star army. Judging from their performance, just now, they had completely integrated into the army. At the same time, they wanted to perform better in the next battle. This was what really stimulated him. He was also a Jurchen knight, so he knew how proud the people of this race were. Unless the opponent's strength was boundlessly strong, how could they be so sincere? Could it be that the 5-star army was really that strong? Could it be that this great Ming war god who looked like he was in his early 20s was really a deity who had descended from the heavens and had the ability to command an army at such a young age? Suddenly, Yi La felt a weight on his shoulder. Out of instinct, Yi La wanted to fight back. However, no matter how hard he tried, the big hand remained unharmed. Even though he was drenched in cold sweat, he still couldn't do anything to the big hand. You should be able to tell that these people are also from the Jurchen tribe. Since you're here, let's go in and have a chat. If you have anything to say, you can find me at any time. Yang Qindong's voice was like a spring breeze as it traveled into Yi Le's ears. Then, the large hand moved away, and Yi La felt that he could move again. She turned around and saw Yang Qindong striding away, surrounded by a group of people. For some reason, his back seemed to have become so tall and big at this moment. Wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, Yi La thought that it was fortunate that he chose to surrender. Otherwise, he was afraid that the big hand just now could have easily taken his life. Yi La suppressed the anxiety and panic in his heart. After adjusting his mood, he strode into the barracks. He wanted to see what kind of charm the 5-star army had that could make Hulu and the other tribesmen submit so sincerely and even be proud of becoming a member of the 5-star army. Tiger's Mane, who was beside Yang Qindong, had a constipated look on his face. He seemed to have something to say. If you have something to say, just say it. Looking at you like that, even I feel uncomfortable. This change naturally couldn't escape Yang Qindong's eyes, and he teased him. Hee, Tiger's Mane, have you been eating too much meat recently? Your poop is dry. Beta Persei couldn't help but tease him. As soon as he said this, Qiu Vi, Dao Xiao, and the others also looked like they wanted to laugh, but they didn't dare to. It was really uncomfortable to hold it in. Yang Qindong's authority was naturally inviolable. As the most trusted person by his side, Tiger's Mane's reputation was not something that anyone could joke about. Only Beta Persei knew when to joke and when to be serious. Get lost, your poop is dry. When Beta Persei said this, Tiger's Mane's face darkened, and he looked like he was about to beat someone up. Beta Persei was naturally not afraid. In terms of martial arts, he was no worse than Tiger's Mane. The two of them were on par, so this time he puffed out his chest and looked like he was ready to fight if Tiger's Mane wanted to. Tiger's Mane had no choice but to turn his head and look at Yang Qindong, saying, "Young master, I have a feeling that this Yella is very scheming and doesn't seem to be sincere about surrendering." "I know." Yang Qindong's footsteps did not stop, and he just nodded softly. Young master knows?" This made Tiger's Mane have no choice but to stop what he was about to say. Originally, he just wanted to remind Yang Qindong not to be deceived by others' facades. After all, the young master was still young, and he had won many battles. Who knew if the word pride would appear in his heart? But now that he heard Yang Qindong say that he knew, Tiger's Mane immediately shut his mouth and stopped talking. Since the young master knew everything, what else did he have to say? Was he trying to trick him? Tiger's Mane did not continue, and Yang Qindong spoke instead. "Of course, I know that Yella won't sincerely surrender so soon, but you have to have confidence in yourselves. What we can give is far beyond what the current Ming can give. This is where our confidence lies. Believe me, even if Yella doesn't sincerely surrender now, the facts will slowly change him and let him make the right decision. Oh, by the way, thank you for your reminder. We can do more of this in the future. As long as you feel that something is wrong, you can make suggestions to me," Yang Qindong said in a polite manner, but he did not emphasize that he would not accept the opinions they put forward. After receiving Yang Qindong's thanks, Tiger's Mane was naturally flattered. "Young master, I dare not say that. This is what we should do. Ha 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 ha." After Yang Qindong heard this, he patted Tiger's Mane's shoulder, then turned and strode back to his tent. At this moment, Yang Qindong suddenly understood what it meant to be lonely at the top. As he became stronger and stronger, his status also became higher and higher. Even people close to him, like Tiger's Mane, had to keep a certain distance from him. The ancients called the emperor Guren, which meant lonely. Now that he thought about it, it was true. Once one's position reached a certain point, one's every word and action would determine the future of many people and even their life and death. At this time, one could not be affectionate. Otherwise, it would inevitably affect one's judgment and decision. Giran? Yang Qindong shook his head. He did not know how far he would go in the future. However, he clearly knew that he still had a long way to go. If he wanted to lead the Han people to the top of the world, there were still many things that he needed to do. If he wanted to achieve this goal, it would be very difficult to rely on the Han people alone. Thus, he would need the help of more people. If the female Taoist was willing to assist him, he wouldn't mind using her. After that, he would do his best to compensate her as much as possible. After all, many of them were born in the Han language, so they weren't outsiders. At worst, the Han people would be first, the Nuzin and the other races would be second, and the other foreigners would be third or fourth. In short, Yang Qindong was using his magnanimity to expand the strength of his army. He was working hard to achieve the great goal in his heart. Yang Qindong returned to the tent. After an hour, Tiger's Ming came to report that Yi La was outside the tent. Please. Yang Qindong raised his head and put aside the Tatar intelligence report from the Security Bureau. The tent was opened from the inside, and Beta Persei accompanied Yi La in. In the tent, Yi La walked forward. When he was 7 or 8 steps away from Yang Qindong, he knelt down on one knee and said, "General, Yi La greets the 6th young master." He did not call him the Duke of Loyalty, but changed to the 6th young master. From this, it could be seen that he should know a lot of things from Hulu and also some of the rules in the camp. Stand up and talk. Yang Qindong sat there, looking straight ahead with a calm expression. Chapter 673. Thank you, 6th young master, Yi La said respectfully. Yi La respectfully said. Then he slowly stood up and lowered his head. His submissive appearance caused Hu Mang and Yang Er to curl their lips at the same time. Clearly, they did not quite believe that Yi La had become so respectful in such a short period of time. The corners of Yang Qindong's mouth curled up as he smiled bitterly. He looked at Yi La and asked, "How is it? Have you spoken to Hulu and your clansmen?" In response to 6th young master's question, "We've talked." Yi La replied respectfully, but his heart was already in turmoil. Ever since he entered the Nuzin tribe's camp, he had only seen and heard for less than an hour, but it had given him a huge shock. The originally arrogant clansmen were now full of admiration for Yang Qindong. Some of them even suggested that as long as they clung onto the 6th young master's thigh, once he became powerful, their Nuzin tribe spring would come. When that time came, they would be able to completely change their oppressed state and obtain more power and freedom. It was fine if only one person said that, but when everyone said the same thing, including their general Hulu, Yi La couldn't help but feel terrified. How long had it been? It had only been slightly more than 10 days since they had returned without informing him that the 5 Astral Army had taken control of Narcissus Town. How did the Duke of Loyalty manage to change the hearts of these men? Judging others by his own standards, he thought that since Hulu and the others could be changed in a very short period of time, then would the 500 cavalry led by him and Lu Dai be infected sooner or later and become loyal to Yang Qindong? What would he do if that really happened? While he was feeling terrified, he was called to the side by Hulu. In the past, this person wasn't even qualified to meet his subordinates. Now he was already a battalion commander in a 5-star army. With this status, Hulu was no longer afraid of Yi La. On the contrary, he was advising him earnestly. "General Yi, I already know that you were captured, but I didn't go to see you immediately. It wasn't because I was afraid of being affected, but because I wanted you to make the right decision. You should understand that only by following the 6th young master can we have a bright future. The descendants of the Nuzin tribe will definitely be proud of our choice today." Proud? Yi La shook his head in disagreement. "What? Isn't General Yi only able to see us because you chose to surrender? Or are you just pretending to surrender and looking for a chance to leave? If it's the latter, I can only advise you that your decision is wrong, very wrong, because you have done a lot for the Nuzin of Narcissus Town in the past. There was no respect in Hulu's eyes. Instead, it was replaced by mockery, mocking Yi Le's arrogance and ignorance. Wrong. Where did this come from? Don't you know that only freedom is true happiness? Although we Nuzin are weak, as long as several generations work together, it won't be long before we can fly freely like the eagles in the world. That's what we should be doing. Yella was also trying to convince Hulu. Hulu had a battalion of soldiers under his command. If he added his own men, he would be able to gather close to 1,000 men. If everyone swore an oath together, they would have a certain chance of killing their way out of here. Eagles? Would the eagle really be happy? Let's not talk about whether we Nuzin can have such a day. Even if we become eagles, won't we become the target of hunters? After so many years, how many eagles and gerfalcons have died at our hands? General Yi, let's face reality. The strength of the 6th young master is not something you can see through. If such a person is our friend, then it will be great. If he is our enemy, then it will be a nightmare for the Nuzin. In order to prevent this nightmare from coming true, surrendering is the best decision. After saying this, Hulu didn't wait for Yi La to refute and continued. General Yi, I don't know if you thought about it, but if Bai Ming's army loses this battle and you provide the information, how will Bai Ming treat you in the future? If Bai Ming's army disappears and you're the only one left alive, how can they be satisfied? You have nowhere to go. Yi La originally wanted to continue arguing with Hulu, but after hearing Hulu's words, she became speechless. That's right. This time, Sun Hong and the others had received his intelligence before sending out their troops. Now that their commander had died in battle, and all the soldiers had been captured by the 5-star army, not a single one of them had escaped. If he escaped, how would he explain it? Yi La was still thinking about the serious consequences of this matter. Hulu opened his mouth again. So the only thing you can do now is to hold on to the 6th young master's thigh and leave here. Only if you disappear with the rest of the Bai Ming army, no one will suspect you. Otherwise, once you appear, it will be the biggest nightmare for the Nuzin people. This sigh. Yi La wanted to say that he could explain to the Bai Ming army, but he thought that he was just a Qianhu. This time, the Bai Ming army lost so much that they needed a scapegoat. At this time, no one would listen to him. In order to shirk their responsibility, they would definitely hand him over. At that time, it would be hard to argue. Not only that, even if he died, he would have to bear the name of the Bai Ming army. In order to take revenge, the Nuzin people would be implicated. No, it should be said that they would definitely be implicated. In this short period of time, Yi La had thought of many things. For example, since he couldn't go back, he might as well do it alone. If he couldn't do it in the Dusi area, then he could go to the territory occupied by Vala and the Mongols. However, when he thought about how much resources an army would need to travel thousands of miles, how much would they need? Without enough strength, what would happen if they encountered a strong enemy with only a few hundred people? Once these problems appeared, he had to reject them one by one. After thinking about it, it seemed that there was only one conclusion. That was that staying in the 5-star army was the best plan. Reality forced Yi La to face this problem. Seeing that Yi La seemed to have understood, Hulu suggested, General Yi, I know that Water Fairy Town is not the only town under your protection. There are other towns nearby, and even some bandits who have taken over the mountains. You're also supporting them, aren't you? If that's the case, you can lead them to the 5-star army. As long as these people are capable, and the 6th young master can see it, then you won't be far from success. At that time, you will become a great general and have power. Our Nuzin people will also benefit from your glory. As for which path to take, General Yi, please reconsider. Hulu had already said what he needed to say. If Yi La still couldn't think it through, then there was nothing he could do. Even with Hulu's IQ, He could see these things clearly, not to mention Yella, who was much smarter than him. After he figured it out, he came to see Yang Qindong. At this time, whether it was in terms of attitude or mentality, he was much more respectful. This was his only hope, and he had to grab hold of it. At this moment, Yue was standing in front of Yang Qindong in the tent. His entire aura had changed. Yang Qindong could feel the respect that came from the bottom of his heart. Since we're done talking, what do you plan to do next? Yang Qindong knew that Yi La must have been influenced by Hulu, but he was still curious about what Yi La would do. Sixth young master, do you still lack soldiers? How many people can the army support with the provisions and equipment? Yi La didn't immediately say what he was going to do next. Instead, he asked these questions in an inquiring tone. He was waiting for Yang Qindong to give him an answer. Unexpectedly, as soon as he said this, Tiger, Mane, and Beta Persei beside him shouted at the same time, "Yi La, isn't this something you can inquire about? What do you want to do?" "Stand down," Yang Qindong said, casually waving his hand and ordering Generals Hung and Ha to stand down. Then he looked at Yi La thoughtfully, as if he had already thought of something. "Of course we lack manpower, but what we lack are all experienced elites. If it's just ordinary soldiers, then forget it. As for provisions and equipment, you don't have to worry about them. As long as they are elites, you can take as many as you have." This time, they were fighting a battle away from the sea. It was far from being like fighting Jiaoji and Kanglin Kingdom, where they could rely on the sea to provide logistical support at any time. Fortunately, they had just defeated Bai Ming's army of more than 10,000 and snatched a lot of good things from their hands. It was enough for the army to last for a while. As for the future, Yang Qindong wasn't worried. If they ran out of supplies, they could rob. Whether it was Bai Ming, Walla, or the Mongolian army, they could all become his granaries. This was where his confidence came from. As long as he had enough strength, he would open up a supply route and directly provide military supplies from the sea. Okay. Yang Qindong really answered him. Yi La sighed in his heart, and at the same time, he knelt on the ground again. In that case, this sinful general is willing to recruit soldiers for the sixth young master. There are more than 10 forces that I secretly support near the Sa-Cha River. They are all led by the Nuzin, and there are many experienced elites. This sinful general is willing to bring them to the sixth young master and let them join the 5-star army to help the sixth young master succeed. From then on, the Nuzin are willing to respect the sixth young master and protect and survive. In just a few words, Yi La not only put his own life and future on the line, but also the Nuzin people that he could influence. It had to be said that he was very bold. You're tuning in to the Thunder Spear YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.